We're live.
So Brandon, it's all yours now.
All right, we're ready to go? Okay. All right, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brandon Love, and I'm a volunteer with the International Manifesto Group and an activist based out of Ottawa, Canada. Today's panel is entitled Anti-Imperialism and the Western Left. The idea for this panel emerged from the recognition that the Western left has consistently failed to oppose their own government's aggression towards working people of the world. This failure stems from the Western left's inability to understand capitalism's primary logic of accumulation, imperialism. In the imperialist world system, the developed countries in the US-led global north not only extract value from the global south through raw materials and human labor, but also through the underdevelopment and de-development of said countries through structural readjustment, color revolutions, wars, sanctions, and other means. Imperialism and the contradiction between the global north and the global south must be identified as the primary contradiction that will result in the unraveling of all others. And I just want to state that in another way. The defeat of imperialism on the world stage will allow the people of the world to pursue their own independent path free of Western imperialist domination. This does not mean that countries once freed from this imperialist domination will immediately become socialist or democratic or any other utopian notion, but rather the contradiction will no longer be between global north and global south on the world stage, but between proletariat and bourgeoisie on the national stage, without the US violently tipping the scales. However, this event does not intend on dwelling on Marxist terminology or a mere academic understanding of the imperialist world system, but towards a practical one that can help inform the Western left how to respond to today's local and international political struggles. The need for the anti-imperialist left to have ongoing discussions, to set out our case openly, compare experiences in different countries, and develop our proposals for dealing with issues confronting today's world is becoming increasingly apparent as anti-imperialists are derided by both liberals and leftists alike. Disparaging terms such as tanky, conspiracy theorist, or useful idiot, coupled with thinly veiled accusations of acting as foreign agents, have become ubiquitous, not only within mainstream liberal discourse, but increasingly within what has now passed as socialist or leftist currents, who take a neither Washington or Beijing stance. Such dismissals are accompanied by openly suppressive tactics, such as deplatforming, refusals to publish or engage with honest or factually sound refutations of propaganda claims, and the circulation of denunciations of fellow socialists reminiscent of the McCarthy era. The left's failure to grasp the central importance of imperialism in today's divisive geopolitical landscape leads to support for wars of aggression, uncritical regurgitation of unfounded or spurious propaganda claims, and support for far-right currents in other countries without the slightest concern for the actual program and policies of these movements, all in the name of a democracy that none of these currents even pretend to respect. This misunderstanding of imperialism also results in the Western left completely misunderstanding the role of anti-imperialist countries, socialist or otherwise. To take one example, China, regardless of the contradictions of its socialist development, has done more to advance the living conditions of poor and working people than any other government in history, but it is dismissed largely as an authoritarian dystopia. Outside of this bubble inhabited by a privileged 1/6 of the world population, most people of the world recognize China as a country in support of an international community with a shared future for humankind, based on common values, UN principles, and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, as expressed not only in the preamble to their constitution, but in their actual existing foreign policy. China's real threat to the West is that it directly threatens its economic hegemony through its own sovereign economic development and its willingness to support other global South countries to pursue their own independent development paths, largely through their Belt and Road Initiative. However, it must be stated that anti-imperialist politics on their own are not enough. We must avoid and impose unprincipled mistakes, such as tailism, which is the act of reflecting in our own politics the most reactionary views of the working class. This is unprincipled because it undermines the political and revolutionary potential of the working class and assumes they cannot overcome these reactionary views. These reactionary views are instilled to sow disunity and discord within the working class. Not opposing them is tantamount to an act of class collaboration, essentially doing the work of the ruling class for free. Anti-imperialist politics must not be reactionary. They must aim to build the largest possible working class coalition. And today, the conditions are ripe for socialist organizing and agitation, but class struggle rages within the left when it should be waged by the left. That section of the Western left, which is proving unable to understand the role of imperialism in shaping today's conflicts, not only places itself on the verge of historical irrelevance, but becomes a real threat to the advance of socialist and worker struggles. At the same time, a genuinely anti-imperialist left is emerging and growing as more and more activists, sickened by the hypocrisy of their government's propaganda, examine it more and more critically. This new left is not prepared to take at their word the elites who at one and the same time armed Saudi Arabia, vilify and sanction the critics of the Israeli apartheid state, whilst imposing vicious and punitive campaigns of economic sanctions and regime change against the poor people of not only China, but Venezuela, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Russia, Iran, indeed any country whose government, for whatever reason, stands up to them. The cause of the most urgent problems facing humanity, notably war, mass poverty, racial and gender oppression, ecological destruction, and pandemics, have to be debated out in the framework of a clear understanding that they are products of imperialism. The solution has to be debated out in the framework of an equally clear understanding that they cannot be solved without a thoroughgoing defeat of imperialist aspirations and actions. So with all that said, I'd like to start and introduce some of one of our 6 speakers for the day. I'm going to just introduce them in turn and not just go over them all right now, just to save a bit of time. And up first, we have Benjamin Norton. He's a journalist, writer, and filmmaker. He's the founder and editor of the independent media outlet Multipolarity, where he reports in both English and Spanish. His journalism focuses primarily on US foreign policy and geopolitics. He has reported from many countries around the world and is currently based in Latin America. So Ben, go ahead.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being here. This is an important panel, so I'm glad I could speak here today. In my presentation today, I'm going to talk about how imperialism has been one of the key elements, one of the key issues that has led to splits historically within the left, especially within the so-called Western left, and how many of those splits are not necessarily even organic splits. I want to focus on the role of states, specifically the US government, in facilitating and encouraging these splits within the left and trying to create what the CIA has long called a compatible left. The CIA has also referred to it as a non-communist left. I think we have to really understand that going back really to the history of the organized socialist movement, imperialism has been the key issue that has led to splits within existing socialist parties and organizations. We can go back to the Second International, which split in 1916 over the fundamental question, the contradiction of World War I. And Vladimir Lenin and his allies famously denounced the Social Democrats who supported World War I as social chauvinists. And this led to the split within numerous social democratic parties, including within Russia itself. I mean, let's not forget that the party was called the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party at the time. The Bolsheviks were technically social democrats at that moment, but that was the historical moment at which social democrats became identified as those who supported imperialism, and communists, the new creation of the Communist Party of Germany and the Spartacus League before that, and then eventually the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the communist movement and the Third International became associated with anti-imperialism. So I think we need to understand that going back to that important history, the question of imperialism and anti-imperialism has been fundamental to understanding the international left and the splits that have emerged within it. And after the Bolshevik Revolution and after World War I, the US government began investing more and more resources in the first and then the second Red Scares into encouraging these splits. And I want to focus on an organization that is not well known, but I think anyone who considers himself a socialist or even a progressive needs to understand the history of the so-called Congress for Cultural Freedom. And we now have declassified documents. This is well substantiated in research by scholars like Gabriel Rockhill, who I would definitely invite everyone here to check out his very important scholarship. Also, Joel Whitney has a book called Thinks about how the CIA encouraged certain strands of left-wing thought, literary thought. And there's another great book by Francis Stoner Saunders called The Cultural Cold War. All of these books document how after World War II, the CIA encouraged the creation of a non-communist left, or a compatible left, they called it, that was pretty explicitly imperialist, or at very least anti-imperialist, you could say. We know that the CIA funded many journals and publications, including the Partisan Review. The CIA also funded many musicians and artists and prominent cultural figures who pushed a kind of pro-imperialist or anti-imperialist left-wing politic. We know, for instance, that the godmother of bourgeois liberal feminism, Gloria Steinem, was herself a CIA agent. And you can find footage online of Gloria Steinem saying openly in an interview that the CIA is a progressive institution, that she had no problem working with the CIA. And we, of course, saw something very similar reflected in a recruitment video that the CIA released just last year in 2021, in which a Latina woman talks about how she's an intersectional feminist and how the CIA encourages her to, fulfill herself as a woman of color and who has, bipolar personality disorder or something. I mean, so we see once again that the CIA and the US government in general has been investing a lot of resources into trying to cultivate a certain kind of left. And of course, that left is one that uses left-wing rhetoric while objectively defending US imperialist interests. And we began this session referring to smears like the term tanky. That's become a popular word, not only used by people who identify as socialists, but even prominent liberal pundits who write from the New York Times and the Washington Post have begun smearing anti-imperialists as tankies, which shows how mainstream this idea has become. And again, I think you need to understand the role of state institutions in encouraging this. Now, I think we also need to understand that some of the most iconic figures in the so-called Western left, in the pantheon of Western left history, have been direct participants in this infrastructure of US government co-opment. I'm thinking specifically of Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse has been referred to as the godfather of the new left with a capital N and capital L. We shouldn't forget that Herbert Marcuse, the reason he really came to fame was because he worked for the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA created by Wild Bill Donovan. And Herbert Marcuse's research against the Soviet Union was directly sponsored by the US government. Herbert Marcuse wrote probably his most important book, at least that established him before One-Dimensional Man, which was Soviet Marxism. And this was a critique of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from a Marxist perspective. That book was based on research funded by the OSS, that is the predecessor to the CIA, and the State Department. Herbert Marcuse was brought in by the OSS originally to do research about Nazi Germany, but after the end of World War II, he continued working for the US government. He later worked for the State Department and continued doing research against the Soviet Union. So while the CIA, through Operation Paperclip, was absorbing the intelligence apparatus and the scientific apparatus of Nazi Germany, hiring, for instance, the head of Nazi German intelligence on the Eastern Front, and then creating a faction within the CIA that was staffed by these former Nazi intelligence officers who also became capitalist West Germany's intelligence apparatus. At the same time, the US government was also recruiting anti-Soviet Marxists to provide left-wing cover for the original Cold War, the first Cold War. And Herbert Marcuse's work, Soviet Marxism, became iconic and extremely influential on creating this non-communist left, creating a kind of ideological stanchion structure to base this compatible left on. And it's no surprise, as Gabriel Rockhill has shown in his reporting, that a lot of the Marxists that are taught in Western academia are the ones who either were explicitly pro-imperialist or had no interest in anti-imperialism. And of course, I'm talking about the Frankfurt School, many of the figures of whom not only worked for the OSS, some of them also worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And again, many of them were recruited originally to do work against Nazi Germany, which is, of course, understandable completely. But then later, they continued working for the US government, and then they turned their targets toward the Soviet Union. So we need to understand, again, that these institutions have been actively going after the left just as much as they have been supporting the right internationally. When we're talking about the idea of manufacturing consent, who is the target of manufacture of consent? It tends to be people on the left, because clearly the US government doesn't need to manufacture consent for conservatives to support its wars on socialism around the world. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about a few other figures I think that are really representative of how the discussion about the pro-imperialist tendency in the Western left, this tendency has been actively cultivated and supported by the US government. I think there's another name that should be well known, which is Carl Gershman. Carl Gershman was a leader of what had been an important organization in the US left called Social Democrats USA. Social Democrats USA was one of the organizations that split out of the Socialist Party of America, which split into three factions. And one of the reasons that it split was the question of the Democratic Party and its relation to the Democratic Party. But another important contradiction was debate over Vietnam. And of course, we know that within SDS and within SNCC, there were debates over Vietnam. There were factions that were more militant that supported the Vietnamese people's resistance against the genocidal imperialist war that led to 3.8 million Vietnamese deaths. But then there were also factions of the left that were against the US war, but also against the armed resistance of the Vietnamese people to this genocidal onslaught. And then there were even factions which became the Shachtmanites, led by Max Shachtman, who had been a Trotskyite, who later became a complete neoconservative, who supported the war and also supported Bay of Pigs and others. But that's a long history I don't have time to get into. But I want to talk about Carl Gershman. So Social Democrats USA split out of the Socialist Party of America. Carl Gershman was a leader of Social Democrats USA, and he later became the founding director from 1983 until last year, 2021, of the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. Many people who are watching this probably know what the NED is. This is a CIA cutout created by the Ronald Reagan administration, CIA under William Casey, in order to fund a lot of these compatible left groups, also right-wing groups. But let's not forget that it was the Solidarity so-called union in Poland, again, giving left-wing cover to objectively pro-imperialist, anti-communist activities that the CIA funded through the NED to eventually lead to the overthrow of the Polish People's Republic. So we know that the NED has been one of the main institutions in funding a lot of these non-communist left groups and compatible left groups around the world. I'm in Nicaragua right now. I mean, in 2018, there was a violent coup attempt against the elected Sandinista government. And there were people who called themselves leftists, even socialists, who were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, including former Sandinistas who became U.S. embassy informants from a party called the MRS Party, the Movement for Renovation of Sandinismo. So this U.S. strategy of creating a compatible left, a pro-imperialist left, continues very much to this day. And the last thing I'll say is that with the new Cold War, I think it is very clear that the U.S. government and Western European governments, I'm not as familiar with the role of European governments in doing this, but we can bet, I'm sure that there is evidence of European governments doing the same thing that the US government has been doing for decades in supporting this anti-communist pro-imperialist left. But in terms of the new Cold War on China and Russia, it is very clear, I've shown it in some of my reporting, that the NED has been funding a lot of groups that call themselves socialists and anarchists and even feminists and anti-racist, but who are explicitly anti-China. I did a report recently about how the US government, the US embassy in France, is funding a feminist Uyghur podcast about how evil China is and how China is supposedly this patriarchal racist hellscape. And this feminist Uyghur podcast is funded by the US government and is co-hosted by a former CIA officer. So it's very clear that in the new Cold War, the US government continues putting a lot of resources into creating and foment and cultivating an anti-communist, pro-imperialist left that will provide so-called a left-wing justification for the proxy war on Russia and Ukraine and the new Cold War on China. So I think we should be very vigilant, and we should understand that while we're talking about the fundamental problems of the pro-imperialist social chauvinist tendency within much of the Western left, we should understand that there is a material basis for that ideology continuing to reproduce itself socially. And that material basis is very frequently resources coming directly from capitalist and imperialist governments like the United States.
I think you're muted, Brandon.
Okay, I guess I got muted. Yeah, thank you so much for that history, Ben. I think it's really important that we know about what the state has done to deride anti-imperialists, and moving forward, how do we respond to that? So thank you so much. Next up, we have Maria Paz Victor, PhD. She is a sociologist born in Venezuela, now retired from university teaching, and it's now dedicated to writing. She's a frequent commentator on issues related to Latin American history and politics, and she's participated in numerous events on TV, radio, and public meetings. In addition, she has her own weekly radio program about Venezuela in the Spanish language community radio of Toronto. And go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I totally agree with the speakers, Brendan's comprehensive exposition and Ben Norton's brilliant historical exposition of the CIA. I really salute you both. My intervention is a bit more humble and narrow. I wish to mention briefly some key aspects about imperialism today in this 21st century, but concentrate on its relation to Venezuela. So it's more like a case. First of all, imperialism involves the desire and the ability of one nation to overpower, dominate, or persuade other nations to act in the best interest of the empire's own aims. So imperialism today is a new colonialism that does not necessarily take over militarily large tracts of land or peoples or nations, but seeks to destroy the sovereignty of established states, weaken them, impose a tutelage over them in its quest for natural resources, advantages, and hegemonic power. Today, a new way of waging war has been added to military war, the hybrid war. That's economic, diplomatic, legalistic, mediatic, and is equally lethal. Now, there's only one empire right now, and it's the USA. And it's intent on remaining so, on being the one hegemon, the superpower with its firm allies in Europe and Canada. It is the only nation that has about 800 military bases around the world. The USA has the largest armed forces in the world. It's the #1 arms manufacturer and seller in the world. And war has been its main instrument and business for most of the 20th century and now the 21st. Consequently, Washington's foreign, diplomatic, economic, and financial policies are no longer different from its military objectives. The private and public spheres have also been greatly combined with the militarization of its foreign policies, and it cloaks a profound class struggle, domestic as well as international, counting on the formidable power of corporate media. Now, empires try to mask their military power with its autoritas, the narrative facade about the empire's worth, quality, superiority, benevolence. It provides an apparent reason for its domination of other peoples and nations. You see, empires cannot hold their power just by force, as that would be prohibitively expensive. They need to convince other nations to submit. This is its ideology, its superstructure that masks, upholds, promotes its military infrastructure. The USA society, historically, culturally, psychologically, is steeped in racism. So obviously, also its hegemonic ideology. Now, Washington has lost a great deal of its hegemonic aura after a slew of failures and lies. Vietnam, for a starter, and the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in invading Iraq, of futile wars and endless coups d'etats, interference with other nations' governance, and its trashing of international law when it suits them. In other words, the ideology of the empire has worn thin. Now, whether Washington likes it or not, a multipolar world is emerging, and the empire's ideology is not so believable anymore. Now, capitalism is in a stage referred to as corporate capitalism, but which Hugo Chavez ingeniously called savage capitalism, and Washington is its main exponent. It's characterized by the preponderance of corporate finance and speculation. It's only marginally bent on producing and satisfying citizens' needs. Labor and its representatives have been undermined, marginalized, criminalized even. The corporate market largely determines political decisions, thus undermining democratic institutions such as parliaments, political parties, the law, judicial power, all of that. And corporate unrestrained power has led to widespread inequality and political polarization, as Thomas Piketty has most clearly pointed out in his famous book. So domestic autoritas is also fractured within the USA. Chris Hedges even considers that the USA today, and I quote, is in the last stage in the emergence of corporate totalitarianism. Finance capitalism adds nothing of value to the real economy. It's a casino capitalism made possible by degrading the institutions that guard the common good: education, health, unions, even law. There's an inherent contradiction between the single-minded search for profits of the corporations and the protection of the social common good, most especially the democratic good. Corporations are not democratic entities. They defy real democracy and dominate the nation states. Their power meshes with that of the US empire. In other words, you cannot disengage corporate power from imperialism. Now, a reality that is often overlooked is that today's main industries, arms, energy, and telecommunications, cannot exist in a financial vacuum. They need specific natural resources from the extractive industries: petroleum, lithium, rare minerals, coltan, and other ores. The great economic powers in the North, the USA and its allies, but the grand bulk of the absolutely essential natural resources are in the South. Thus, a new colonialism emerges, camouflaged with all sorts of smoke and mirrors. Free trade that is not free. Promises of trickle-down investment that never trickle. A supposed humanitarian intervention to protect human rights, only some of them. Help nations develop, only where convenient to their enterprises, and to teach other nations about supposed rule of law, which is their rule. And even promote NGOs to protect democracy and the environment, while actually these NGOs are spies and saboteurs. In Venezuela, from 2002 to 2012 alone, the National Endowment for Democracy gave $100 million to create 300 opposition NGOs. Now, the uncontrolled expansion of corporate capitalism, which euphemistically or cynically is referred to as progress, is necessarily predatory. Its insatiable consumerism, rampant industrialization, appalling individualism have catastrophically injured the natural world, polluted land and water, caused climate change, increased species extinction, depleted biodiversity, and is leading us to the sixth extinction if not stopped. Natural resources seem to be viewed as the right of the North, not of the South, where they are found. This divide is profoundly Eurocentric, classist, and racist. A shocking example is the 2010 European Commission report on critical raw materials for the EU. In a matter-of-fact, bureaucratic vocabulary, it unashamedly defines as environmental risk the following: the measures that might be taken by countries with the intention of protecting the environment, and by so doing, endangering the supply of raw materials to the European Union. That's all they care about. They don't care about the environment. The most people, of course, severely impacted by this natural resource devastation in Latin America are the rural campesinos, the rural people, and the indigenous peoples. Now, the most important geopolitical area that Washington believes is absolutely necessary for them to dominate is Latin America and the Caribbean. Not Europe, not Canada, not Asia, not Middle East, not Russia, not China. In this region, the USA has overthrown, destabilized, or invaded about 90 nations since 1900. Every progressive leader or reformer has been killed, opposed, or deposed by Washington, and the victims among the people are countless. As Atilio Borong points out, there are no Monroe doctrines for any other part of the world except in Latin America. The USA considers it their backyard, or as ignominiously Biden has said recently, trying to soften the insult, its front yard. The farce of the USA being any sort of defender of Latin America from European threats, as the Monroe Doctrine spouts, was shown up as a lie when Washington backed the UK's unconscionable war against Argentina over the Malvina Islands, the Falklands. Che Guevara's opinion on imperialism is that it is a bloodthirsty thing ready to slit people's throats, and that you cannot trust imperialism for a minute, not even a little bit. There are too many examples to cite in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and even in the less powerful nations of Europe, where they have all felt the boot of empire on their throat. Now enter the socialism of the 21st century, which is the hope of the future of the region and the world against the savagery of imperialism. Hugo Chavez was reelected in his second term in 2006 by an overwhelming majority who voted for his electoral promise of building what he called socialism of the 21st century in Venezuela as the basis of the Bolivarian Revolution. Its instrument is the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which is formed also by smaller parties and grassroots organizations, not just a government party. But many on the left, especially in the North, USA, Canada, and Europe, have been decrying for years that Venezuela's revolution is not socialist. These cosmopolitan or armchair revolutionaries have too often disdained the Bolivarian Revolution because it did not fit with their narrow Eurocentric theoretical framework. Some mistrusted Chavez because he was a military man. Others ridiculed him because he was an acknowledged Catholic. And yet others on the left have gone so far as saying Venezuela did not have a revolution because it did not take up arms outright and kill the capitalists. I myself have been confronted various times, being on a panel, by those who want to see blood on the ground. Not their blood, of course, but somebody else's. They have said to my face that because it was not born by taking up arms, like the Cuban Revolution, Venezuela was not a real one. I had the great honor of sitting next to the Consul General of Cuba, who whispered in my ear to pay no attention to such nonsense, as if Fidel and Che wanted to kill their compatriots, as if they thought that killing was the cornerstone of a socialist revolution. Venezuela's revolution does include the analysis of Marx and Engels, but not exclusively. It's also based on Venezuela's indigenous communitarian traditions, on the principles of its revolutionary liberator, Simón Bolívar, which were sovereignty, egalitarianism, repudiation of slavery and imperialism, and regional Latin American integration. It's also nurtured by other Venezuelan heroes such as Simón Rodríguez on education and Ezequiel Zamora on land reform. Its revolution is as well humanistic and spiritual. It is inclusive and respectful of indigenous cosmologies and inspired by liberation theology. As well, it is participatory and democratic as it gained power through the ballot box. It does not follow the pattern of the Russian, Chinese, or even entirely the Cuban Revolution. It's his own thing. Now, Chavez proclaimed it after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the dissolution of the USSR, and the rumors that history had somehow come to an end. And thereby, Chavez showed the world that socialism was not remotely dead. This in the face of those on the left professing socialism who were looking for the illusion of the third way. Let us count the ways of how revolutionary Venezuela is. First of all, Venezuela has asserted its sovereignty over its natural resources, taking over control from elites and international corporations. This has set an example of independence that Washington considers counter to its hegemony, especially since the country has the largest oil reserve in the world and the second largest gold fields. Venezuela society underwent a strong social transformation begun by redefining the state itself with a new constitution anchored on concepts of human rights, both individual and social rights, and includes the rights of indigenous peoples, women, children, social rights to education, health, protecting the environment. And Venezuela has wrestled power from the comprador class, that supremacist elite, upper classes that had ruled for 40 years and drove their people into abject poverty, while wasting the equivalent of 15 Marshall Plans in corruption and illicit enrichment. The revolution has reduced not only poverty, but also inequality. And Venezuela's participatory democracy recognizes communal and social ownership and enshrines the communal state of communal councils, communes, and these are not add-ons, but part of state power. Venezuela has carried out an effective land reform, transforming agriculture to the point that today the nation has food security and is even exporting food, the first time in 100 years. This is due to the masterful policies of President Nicolás Maduro, who has steered the country through the illegal sanctions that have almost destroyed the economy and killed 100,000 Venezuelans. His measures to diversify the economy, to implement an effective internal revenue system, reinvigorated the economy and battled inequality. He got rid of hyperinflation, made Venezuela a stronger, more viable country. Its GDP is estimated will grow by astonishing 20% this year. And it wasn't the Chavistas saying this. This was calculated by Credit Suisse. This after losing 99% of government revenue due to US sanctions. Quite an extraordinary achievement. And during the pandemic, the grassroots organizations and the PSUV all helped the health authorities when Venezuela was not able to buy medical supplies or vaccines. And now it has the best record of controlling the pandemic in the region. And thanks for the amazing solidarity of countries of China, Russia, and Cuba. Now, the genius of Hugo Chavez is that he was able to articulate a socialist ideology that was rooted in Venezuelan cultural and political history. Before that, socialist and communist inroads had been very weak because they were seen as a foreign thing, a northern, theoretical, alien to the history, the culture, the cosmology of ordinary Venezuelans. Now, while not demeaning for a second the very positive and brave, even heroic struggles and contributions that members of Venezuela's oldest political party that's the Communist Party. The fact is that it never had a significant popular following in or out of elections because it was not rooted in the people's profound sense of history, their culture, tradition, spirituality. The Bolivarian Revolution does all this, as well as making clear the class struggle and the dynamics of capitalism. But to its admirable, selfless merit, the Communist Party of Venezuela has always supported the PSUV, especially in its struggles against imperialism. And this is very important for the West, the West and the North to realize that they may not agree with everything of the Bolivarian Revolution, but they are with it in its struggle. Domestically, inside Venezuela, many who proclaim being on the left criticize the government, President Maduro. They are, in fact, armchair theorists that use the excuse of self-criticism to simply oppose a government and a movement which has rejected them and their advice because they have been far from the grassroots and real links to the people. Their criticism is cheap, as they bear no responsibility in feeding and nurturing a population, nor in facing a formidable foreign power. They invariably end up being the darling of the right. Now, Venezuelans don't think they have ultimately arrived at socialism, but they consider it a process, a way that they must go down until the entire bourgeois state has been transformed. They're not there yet, and they know it. But the international left, on the other hand, has had reservations from the very beginning, if not open criticism of Venezuela's brand of socialism. The reasons are ugly, tainted by cultural determinism and even racism. First, there's Eurocentrism. For many, anything that deviates from Marx and Engels or any other European communism or socialist experience is not the real thing. This is actually very ironic, if not knee-slapping funny, in view of the fact that none of these northern theorists or activists have actually been able to carry out any socialist revolution in North America or Europe. Yet they think they have the right to point out to the lesser beings in Venezuela and Latin America what is real and what is not, and that they have got it all wrong. Secondly, the international critics of Bolivarian Revolution are ignorant of Venezuelan culture, specifically its political culture, and I may venture to say that it is willful ignorance and also tainted with racism. And thirdly, many on the left have not fully understood that there is not one road to socialism, but many, that Venezuela revolts at the thought that it had to pattern its revolution on one unique pattern, on a foreign strategy, and give up its idiosyncrasy, its identity to create socialism. The
Just a
goals
2-minute
of Venezuela.
warning, Maria.
Okay, I'm almost finished. The goals of Venezuela socialism are to obtain the health, the happiness of a people, to exercise their self-determination without tutelage, and that the people have power through democratic representation and participatory democracy. Now, if these accomplishments were not enough, Venezuela's heroic triumphs against the illegal sanctions, paramilitary attacks, sabotage, assassinations, coup attempts, demonization were not enough. Just consider the following. The enemies that have lined up against Venezuela, the empire and its allies, the international banking system, the international media, all the fascist organizations of the world, they do recognize a revolution when they see it. Now, despite such formidable challenges, Venezuela has prevailed and triumphed, and today is a more unified, stronger, more economically viable, and more politically determined socialist nation. So Venezuela must be doing something right. In the end, the choice could not be clearer. Will the world continue to give a free ride to a devious, amoral, predatory imperialism? Or will the freely chosen revolutionary socialism of Venezuela that feeds, shelters, health, heals, clothes, inspires, and defends its people be given the international recognition and solidarity that it deserves as the road to hope, peace, and justice in the world? Venezuela's answer is the same as Cuba's. Venceremos. We will prevail. Thank you for listening to me. And sorry, I took up 2 more minutes.
No, that was excellent. No, thank you so much, Maria. And I think your point is exactly right. It's quite clearly a revolution. Otherwise, the US wouldn't be targeting it with all this violent imperialism. So thank you so much for those remarks. That was really powerful. Up next, we have Carlos Martinez. He's an independent researcher and political activist from London, Britain. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, was published in 2019 by Leftward Books. His main area of research is the construction of socialist societies, past and present. He's a co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of No Cold War. So Carlos, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Brandon, and thanks to the IMG for inviting me here today. The focus of my presentation is, why doesn't more of the Western left support the People's Republic of China? Why doesn't more of the Western left engage in a serious way with Chinese socialism? There are lots of things about modern China that seem to be more or less worthy of support from a socialist point of view. Poverty alleviation. Reducing poverty feels like a decidedly leftist objective. If there was no poverty under capitalism, if there were no homeless, no people without sufficient food to eat, without access to education and healthcare, without work or the possibility of earning an income, most people on the left would probably, hopefully, find something better to do with their time than struggling for a new society. So the fact that China has achieved so much in this realm of poverty alleviation should obviously be something that we study and that we celebrate. Okay, not everybody trusts the Chinese government statistics. Not everyone is convinced by the claim that China in 2020 eliminated extreme poverty. Fine. Nevertheless, it's absolutely beyond question that in the period from 1949, when the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, the Chinese people have experienced an unprecedented and extraordinary improvement in their living standards and their level of human development. China was one of the poorest countries in the world. Millions would die every year due to malnutrition, even in non-famine years. The vast majority of the population had no access to education or healthcare. Life expectancy has more than doubled since 1949. China has achieved universal literacy. Everyone has access to education and healthcare. The social and economic position of women has improved beyond recognition. Yes, sure, life expectancy and literacy have improved in much of the world, but in China's case, they've gone from a long way below the global average to a long way above the global average. The United Nations Development Programme describes China as having achieved the most rapid decline in absolute poverty ever witnessed. And yes, there's tremendous inequality in China, and yes, there are billionaires, but actually the economic baseline, the quality of life for the poor is much higher than in other countries of the developing world. The rural poor in China may not have a great deal of disposable income, but they have access to land, they have secure housing, they're not drowning in debt to feudal landlords, their children get educated, They can see a doctor if they need to. They're entitled to a pension. They have water piped into their homes and so on. So they might be considered as poor, but it's a very different category of poverty to that which can be seen elsewhere in Asia and further afield. And there are a number of other areas in which China is making amazing progress. On climate change and biodiversity, China has emerged as a global leader. On the COVID-19 pandemic, China's established the gold standard in terms of going all out to protect human life. The fact that China is able to focus to such a degree on poverty alleviation, on renewable energy, on education, on suppressing the pandemic, on cracking down on corruption, and so on, doesn't reflect some sort of mystical, ethereal quality of Chinese culture. It reflects the fact that the Chinese state prioritizes the needs of ordinary people. And that in itself reflects the fact that the CPC came to power via a revolution that was led by, supported by, sustained by the working class and the peasantry. It was a revolution that created a workers' state, moreover, a workers' state led by a communist party with Marxism as its guiding ideology. And yet, support for Chinese socialism is a pretty niche position on the Western left. Why is that? To start with, an awful lot of people think that China is a capitalist country or even an imperialist country. China has nearly 700 billionaires. A lot's made of China's billionaires. Of course, China's a huge country. Proportionally speaking, actually measured in terms of billionaires per million population, China stands at 0.27, which is actually below the global average of 0.35. Monaco, by the way, is the world leader with 79 billionaires per million population. The US is also well above the global average with just under 2 per million. So China can hardly be said to be, the home of billionaires. But anyway, yes, you can find McDonald's, KFC, and Starbucks in Chinese cities. There's private capital, there are big businesses, there are wealthy individuals, there's significant inequality. There are rich people and there are poor people, there's exploitation of labor, and there is integration into global value chains operated by huge multinationals. So a lot of people on the Western left look at this situation and say, well, this can't be socialism. And yet these people face an ideological trap that's quite difficult to break out of. The standard of living in China has increased dramatically and continuously since 1949, certainly including in the period from 1978, when China is supposed to have gone capitalist. No capitalist country has achieved what China's achieved in terms of improving the lives of ordinary people, certainly not on anything like the scale or for such a sustained period of time. Under capitalism, wealth always has a counterpart in poverty. The United States is one of the richest countries in the world, but tens of millions of people lack access to healthcare. Hundreds of thousands are homeless. And that's before we even consider the extent to which US wealth relies on poverty, war, and destitution elsewhere in the world, which is very much not the case for China. So if China's capitalist, and Chinese capitalism has delivered such extraordinary improvements to the lives of hundreds of millions of people, does that mean that we need to think again about being anti-capitalists? That's a serious question for anti-China leftists. The Chinese themselves have always been very clear. They use market forces within the overall context of a planned and state-run economy in order to stimulate the development of the productive forces. The Chinese state maintains tight control over the commanding heights of the economy, heavy industry, energy, transport, communications, and foreign trade. China's financial system is dominated by the big four state-owned banks, which are accountable not to private shareholders, but to the government and ultimately the people. This level of intervention and regulation, which is the opposite of the free market fundamentalism and the so-called small government neoliberalism that prevails in the West, means that capital isn't in control, that the economy exists to benefit the people as a whole. The land in China continues to be owned and managed at the village level. So from an economic point of view, when you do a bit more investigation, China's much more socialist and much less capitalist than it might appear at a superficial level. And I often quote the Shanghai investor Eric Lee, who's interviewed on John Pilger's film, The Coming War on China. He makes an essential point about how China works. He says, China's a market economy, but it's not a capitalist country. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo in the way billionaires control American policymaking. Capital does not have enshrined rights in China. That is to say, in capitalist countries, the interests of capital come first. The capitalist class is the ruling class. In China, that's manifestly not the case. Look at the top priorities of the Chinese government in recent years. Eradicate extreme poverty, clamp down on corruption, shift to renewable energy, protect biodiversity, protect human life in a pandemic, improve living standards. These goals represent the will of ordinary people, not a capitalist elite. Compare that with the major capitalist countries. Where I am in Britain, we faced years of bitter austerity. Life for ordinary working class people is getting worse all the time. Our death rate from COVID is almost 1,000 times higher than China's. Our progress rolling out renewable energy is painfully and pathetically slow. And the fact that China's government represents the class interests of the masses is also reflected in the fact that it's extraordinarily popular. Studies, including by Western academic institutions, routinely show that the CPC-led government has a 90+% approval rating. Meanwhile, the latest polling data indicates that only 20% of respondents feel that the US Congress is doing a good job. But the US is the democracy, apparently. And the other thing to quickly mention about China and socialism is that the Chinese themselves continue to conceive of their own political trajectory in terms of socialism and communism. Xi Jinping often says, only socialism can save China. And socialism with Chinese characteristics is socialism and not any other kind of ism. All school students learn the basic tenets of Marxism. All the major universities have schools of Marxism. It's kind of difficult to understand why the Chinese would go to such lengths to pretend to be socialist, to pretend to be Marxist. Another important factor in how the Western left engages with China is the propaganda war. A lot of people who won't even give critical support to Chinese socialism are more than happy to give uncritical support to anti-China propaganda put out by Western imperialists. China's the new colonial force in Africa. China's the new colonial force in Latin America and the Caribbean. China is cornering developing countries in debt traps. China's perpetrating a genocide against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. China's preventing Tibetans and Inner Mongolians from speaking their languages. China's trying to wipe out democracy in Hong Kong. And the list goes on. And each item can be and has been comprehensively debunked. But why do people fall for these lies over and over again? It should be perfectly obvious why the US and its allies would wage a propaganda war against China. China's rise constitutes an existential threat for US hegemony. China is, by most measures, the largest economy in the world. It's a leader in multiple key areas of science and technology. It takes an independent and anti-imperialist stance on the global stage and consistently supports the global South, consistently works towards multipolarity. It's a non-white power. It's run by a communist party. For these reasons and more, China's the principal target in the US-led new Cold War, and the propaganda war is part of that. And yet people still fall for it. Why do people who consider themselves to be critical thinkers not think a bit more critically about the information they're being fed? And there are a few elements to this. For one thing, a lot of this propaganda is quite powerful, pretty sophisticated, and it sort of actively connects to progressive ideas and sentiments. Particularly since the Carter administration, US politicians and media have really mastered the use of human rights as a stick to beat their enemies with. They find a problem, they magnify it, they exaggerate it, they build a sort of slick and all-pervasive campaign around it and make you feel like you're a bad person if you don't join in. The accusation of genocide is particularly potent in those terms. By accusing China of genocide in Xinjiang or accusing Russia of genocide in Bucha, you create an emotional, intellectual environment where to stand with China or to stand with Russia is the equivalent of being a Holocaust denier. So you've massively increased the psychological cost of taking a pro-socialist or an anti-imperialist position. The propaganda is very persuasive, very sophisticated, and we have to understand that and we have to systematically counter it. Then the Western left has a couple of quite deep-rooted problems that it needs to face up to. It's got a Eurocentrism problem, and this was referenced by Maria. The trajectory of Marxism over the course of the 20th century was towards the East and the South. It started as the ideology of the North American and West European industrial working class in their struggle against capital. It shifted east, first to Russia, then China, Vietnam, Korea, then south to Cuba, to Mozambique, to Ethiopia, Guinea-Bissau, Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, Nicaragua, Grenada, and elsewhere. It became the ideology of the oppressed masses worldwide against imperialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. It's very significant that the final sentence of the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, reads, "Workers of the world unite." The Comintern, at its second Congress in 1920, at the suggestion of a certain Vladimir Lenin, expanded this to "Workers and oppressed peoples of the world unite." But it feels like a lot of the Western left has never quite caught up with that. You know, in their minds, workers' struggle still mainly looks like white men working in factories and demanding pay rises. The idea of a Chinese or Zimbabwean peasant being at the cutting edge of global class struggle doesn't quite resonate. The less a movement looks and acts like the European working class of the late 19th century, the less support it gets. And if you look at the communist parties in countries like China and Korea, countries that really aren't at all Europeanized, that don't have their philosophical roots in Greece and Rome and so on, they don't fit that bill. Connected to that, the Western left also has a dogmatism problem. Let's just admit it, you know, in spite of, or perhaps because of our lack of success building a socialist project of our own, we've developed very fixed ideas about what socialism is. And those ideas often don't match the messy reality of Chinese socialism, which exists in the real world, which is engaged in a long-term battle for its survival in the face of ongoing imperialist hostility and destabilization, and which therefore has had to make compromises and to develop creative solutions to new and complex problems. How do we go about addressing these issues in our movement? You know, it's a tough question. Hopefully we're going to come back to it in the discussion. I think through the work that various groups and individuals have been doing, including this group, including the International Manifesto group, we're starting to see the reemergence and consolidation of an international anti-imperialist movement. We need to continue developing this work, building unity, deepening our understanding. We need to be cognizant of the propaganda war, and we need to fight resolutely against it. And of course, we need to be alert to the intellectual arrogance and the prejudices that are so easy to absorb when you exist in a culture that's fundamentally racist, fundamentally Eurocentric. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I think you made a very comprehensive and compelling argument of why China absolutely deserves our support as a leading socialist anti-imperialist nation in the world. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. It's Jamu Baraka. He is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and was the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. Baraka serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition. He is an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and co-founding columnist for Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Shem Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism. So Jamu, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm really honored to be a part of this very important conversation, a conversation that we have to engage in because of the contradictions that all of the speakers have addressed. And that is the profound divisions among the left, primarily among the Western or Northern left, that can no longer be avoided. We've always had these contradictions, but we've been able to find ways to unite our forces, usually in anti-imperialist struggles. But right beneath the surface has always lingered what a number of the speakers have spoken to directly and used kind of indirectly. That is this division between the realities and the interests of the peoples of the global South. And when I say peoples of the global South, I'm also referring to those peoples of the global South who also find themselves at the center of the empire also. But that contradiction between our interests and the interests, lifestyles, worldviews of the peoples in the North. And it boils down to what Brandon shared with us at the top of this event as the major contradiction that we believe is in play. And that is that contradiction in which Northern revolutionaries, not all, but significant elements in particular over the last few decades, find it almost impossible to accept that the primary contradiction for many of us in the global South And I say global South because I'm sitting here in Latin America, been here for quite some time, and part of the global South that's in the United States of America, where I organized for 35 years. But that the primary contradiction is between the North and this North-South contradiction. This the people of the South. And as someone alluded to earlier, what is so interesting about this contradiction and the kinds of critiques we see coming from Northern revolutionaries when it comes to the attempts on the part of peoples in the global South to transform themselves and their conditions, is that these critical remarks, these critical stands taken by Northern revolutionaries are stances that seem not to have any basis in practice. Because as I think Maria said, where is the evidence that these Northern revolutionaries have an understanding of how you make revolution, in particular in the conditions of the global South? And in fact, when you look at the experiences of revolutionary struggles in North America, for example, the movement that got the closest to developing a pre-revolutionary conditions, in fact, was the Black liberation movement. And we understand, we know what happened to that movement. I'm proud to be here to represent and to have been a part of those struggles. And now 50 something years later, here in 2022, and seeing what we were struggling for then and now, and that is ultimately the end of white world supremacy. That is the issue that we have to deal with, this issue of white supremacy that many of the speakers touched on, alluded to, that we have to really deal with, because it is this element of normalized white supremacy, normalized white supremacist ideology that is really undermining our ability to effect a effective, powerful anti-imperialist stance on the part of the peoples and struggles and organizations in the global North. We can't avoid this any longer. And I'm going to touch on why that's important related to Ukraine. Ukraine has been a lesson for all of us, because what we have seen with Ukraine is this. When it comes to the white left, we know the history of the ascendancy of what became Western Europe, what became the United States of America. We know that at the core of that ascendancy has been systematic violence, colonial violence. That is the core instrument that's been used to create the so-called West, to create the United States of America. We know that even in the contemporary manifestations of those activities over the last few decades, with the new century, 21st century being the century of the U.S., the progress, the program for a new American century. We know that with the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, that freed up the U.S. from having any countervailing constraints, but that the U.S. put front and center again in direct terms of the use of military force. And we see that beginning, of course, in the 1990s, and we saw that intensifying in the early 2000s. And the result of that has been a tremendous suffering on the part of people of the global South. Even in the last decade or so, with the ascendancy of the first Black president, Barack Hussein Obama, we have the continuation of the wars in Afghanistan, including the surge. We have the war that was begun in Yemen. We have the attack, the NATO-US attack on Libya. We have the intervention into Syria. We had the Venezuela becoming the unusual threat to US policies. So we see that this core instrument of violence, both in terms of direct interventions, but also in terms of subversion and this new weapon they've been so effective at using, sanctions, has resulted in real suffering on the part of people. Now, we had Some people who understood that. We have some elements of the anti-imperialist movement who understood that, who would join us in our demonstrations, who would engage in political activity, political work with the people and with other elements of the left. But how do we explain this, the weakness of the anti-imperialist and anti-war movement, for example, in the US, in the light of all of the obvious criminal activity? How do we explain that, especially when you then compare the responses we've seen with Ukraine, where basically everyone is up in arms? Elements of the left in the US believe that this is the most horrendous experience ever to face humanity, if you will, if you listen to them. Okay, how do you in fact explain that? Well, it's quite obvious for many of us on this call what that element is that helps to explain that, and that is white supremacy. That is the fact that the sufferings of the Ukrainian people, the brought to the living rooms of people around the country every evening with these morality plays we see coming from CNN and MSNBC, exposing people to the realities of war, something that didn't happen or during the last few decades of war since Vietnam. And the response has been quite understandable. People are horrified by war. But the fact that the left did not and has not pushed back on how this has been framed, how a Zelensky can talk about the need to protect the West, to talk about so-called Europeanness, to talk about Western values, and that this struggle in Ukraine is a struggle between the West and everyone else. The very fact that that has not been challenged effectively is a reflection that something new is in place, and that is the obvious use of this white supremacist framework, this what I refer to as the White Lives Matter More movement, that has clearly indicated that there's something special and unique and valuable about white lives as it relates to, or in comparison to, the lives of the millions of people who have been snuffed out as a consequence of US imperialist activities. So this is very, very important, in particular because in this understanding, if you will, this message of the value of white life, part of what the state is doing, along with elements of the white left, is to, in order to support the U.S. agenda in the Ukraine, they are undermining and mitigating the threat of something we see as very, very dangerous, and that is the existence of these neo-Nazi and white supremacist ultra-nationalists in Ukraine, that in their efforts to try to generate public support for the Ukraine, they have played down the significance of these elements that for the last 8 years have been organizing themselves, where we know that there have been white supremacists who have traveled to Ukraine to receive ideological and military training. We know the role of the elements like the Azov battalion. We know that the right wing controlled the streets of Ukraine. We know that the Ukraine became the epicenter, if you will, of the transnational white supremacist movement. Yet, those realities have been whitewashed, if you will, not only by liberals, but by elements of the white left. We find that to be profoundly threatening, because we know that because Clinton says so, Hillary Clinton, that the US is prepared, it has been prepared to utilize Ukraine in ways very similar to how they utilized Afghanistan. They resulted back in the 1980s in the organization of what became Al-Qaeda. Hillary Clinton said that Ukraine had to be could be that same kind of model. And what she was implying there was the possibility of these hardcore white supremacists from around the world going to Ukraine, receiving military experience, arms that are now proliferating every place, and there's no accountability, and the organization of these powerful forces who then will be unleashed against all of us as we go forward. So we see that this is a very dangerous development, that few people are reluctant to really take on for themselves and to take on and to be on historical record in opposition to. So we find this to be a very important element that has to be dealt with. It can no longer be avoided. And so we say very clearly, when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, we've got to talk about white supremacy. Well, we got to talk about the impact of Ukraine on non-European workers and non-property owners, not only in the US, where we see that, again, non-European workers are the ones disproportionately impacted by the consequences of this war in terms of higher gas prices and food prices, this inflation, but also what's happening in Latin America, what's happening on the African continent. It was estimated that because of this Ukrainian war, something like 463 million Africans would be negatively impacted by this war in terms of the accessibility to food and fuel. So this attempt on the part of the US to advance its imperial interests in Ukraine without any regard for the consequences is having a devastating impact on the entire globe. And this this desperate attempt to try to starve off the inevitable ending of white world supremacy suggests to us that these European powers are prepared to take the entire world down with them in order to maintain their global hegemony. We've got to have more voices.
2-minute warning for you.
We need to have more voices ready and prepared to speak out in opposition to this, and not be afraid of being labeled race traitors or whatever. We can no longer avoid the reality that this issue of white supremacy has to be dealt with if we're going to develop an effective anti-war, anti-imperialist movement. Later for these abstractions of world imperialism, we say, for example, in the Black Alliance for Peace, that it's about Western imperialism. It's about the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. We are clear about that, okay? We understand the primary contradiction and the primary enemy. And hopefully we can talk some more about what we need to do strategically to address these issues as we go forward here in this very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajamo. And I think your analysis of white supremacy probably also helps explain some of what the other speakers were talking about in terms of not understanding China because it's not white and not understanding Venezuela. So very, very important points. So our next speaker is going to be Alan Freeman. He's the co-director with Radhika Desai of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. He was an economist at the Greater London Authority between 2000 and 2011, where he held the brief for the creative industries and the living wage. He wrote the Benn Heresy, a biography of British politician Tony Benn, and co-edited 3 books on value theory. He is honorary life president of the UK-based Association for Heterodox Economics and a vice chair of the World Association for Political Economy. So Alan Freeman, Alan, go ahead.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, thank you so much, Brandon, for organizing this. And it's a real pleasure to be an honor to be on this panel with the other speakers. Now, I have decided to call the experience of the Russian special military operation a 1914 moment. And I want to explain why. It's because I think we can learn from history. As Santayana says, those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Now, one lesson in particular stands out because I think we're often prone to feel that we're in some strange way besieged because we're a small number of people. And I want to point out that the true victors in 1914, which were the Bolsheviks, entered the war as a tiny group, but they came out on the side of history. And that's because they understood what was going on. So I do think understanding is a critical thing that we need. Now, the world of 2022 is more complicated. Beside the capitalist countries and socialist movements, it contains socialist countries and fascist movements. Nevertheless, we should study history because not to make superficial analogies, but to study similar events. And that means identifying common causes. So the most important similarity was the political collapse of the so-called socialist left. And in 1914, this was very strong. In Germany, it's reported there were 27 daily social democratic newspapers. It had a world organization, mass trade unions, huge socialist parties. When the war broke out, these parties unanimously, I think the only exception with the Serbians actually, supported their own capitalist. Now, why is this important? Because of Marx's basic lesson, only the working class can liberate humanity because its members own nothing but their labor power. But this only makes it a class in itself. To realize its potential, it must become a class for itself. It must act politically. And it can only do this if it acts on behalf of everybody who shares its condition, not just some of them. Now, in 1914, the socialists decided it was more important to kill other workers than fight their own capitalists. At that moment, the working class in the imperialist countries stopped acting as a class. This is an exact parallel. What do the pro-imperialist left tell us? That let's cut to the chase. It's more important to kill Russian workers than fight Western capitalists. And this is completely naked. The enemy is not anymore Putin or the oligarchs. It's now the Russian people, down to its tennis players, its composers, and Ukraine's Russian speakers. A third of the population besieged, bombed, and brutalized for 8 years by these wonderful Ukrainian nationalists, about which our leftist friends say nothing. Now then, as now, there's been a political collapse, but only in the West. And I think that's very important to understand. We're not isolated. To the contrary, 5/6 of the world is with us. And that's one of the things that's got the propaganda machine running so scared, in my opinion, to the point where they're actually deceiving themselves with their own propaganda, which is, in a perverse way, a useful thing. The First World War was the cradle of colonial revolt. It provoked the Easter Rising. It consolidated Indian nationalism's mass base. It launched Kemalism, Pan-Arabism. It gave birth to African anti-colonialism. Now, today, this polarization is more advanced. Not even India or Saudi Arabia have joined the attack on Russia. And this brings me to a basic point. Imperialism is economic, not political in character. And in the version of this text, which I placed on my academia site, you'll see two charts, and they basically show what happened to Russia after shock therapy. And I recommend to you a book by Ruslan Zarasov, which explains the structure of Russian capitalism. It was brutally reduced to the status of the global South. It's estimated that between 3 and 10 million people died in Russia because of shock therapy. That was an economic battle against the gains of that had been made through through the Soviet experience. So what the imperialist countries do is they did to Russia what they were doing to the rest of the world, and they use this to buy off their own workers. They give them a higher standard of living, they integrated their leaders into the state, and they created professional subclasses that depend on state largesse, forging a popular base that kept them in the power. These bribes, I think somebody's unmuted and is drinking, I can hear it. They come from surplus profit. This is income squeezed out of 5/6 of the world. And it's achieved by a world division of labor, which confines the global south to export minerals, agricultural goods, and the products of such cheap labor, while subjecting it to a northern high-tech monopoly. This was particularly clear in the treatment on Huawei, which was imposed because socialist China, frankly, had better tech. So all the free trade talk went out the window. Now, to put this in perspective, let me give you a simple fact. US GDP per capita is 40 times higher than India. Now, in Marxist terms, that's very simple. The labor of one US worker exchanges for the labor of 40 Indian workers. In short, the USA, Europe, and Japan are living off the labor of the world working class. Now, this leads me to my second contribution. being second greatest contribution of Marx, being determines consciousness. Western socialists, so-called, capitulated then as now because of their material relation to the worker of the world. And this gives them a false consciousness. Very simply described, they think they are superior, exactly as Ajamu has so eloquently described it. The origin of white supremacy is the notion that because we're richer, we must be smarter. That's it. It's a material cause. And this gives them the right to tell everybody else what to do. Actually, they're just robbers. They can't admit that. Nobody could say, oh, I'm a robber and proud, right? Maybe Al Capone, but that's about it, right? So they have a myth, which I call the Columbian myth system, and this substitute for rationality. There's no rationality in the discourse of the West anymore. I don't know why it perceives itself as the birthplace of reason when it's acting like the most insanely uncivilized group of people the world has ever seen. So China actually, so what they do then is they racialize it. They geneticize it. They have to say, why is the rest of the world worse off than us? Because they must be inferior. And this is projected onto its own population of immigrants, people of color. They must be the racial consequence of this world inferiority. That's the root of hubristic racism of the North. And I must say in passing, this is one reason I do have profound doubts about, however well-meaning, what's called patriotic socialism. In my opinion, and we can discuss this, by the way, the most far-sighted US leaders, like Malcolm X, understood that their oppression at home was the result of piracy abroad. So the best hope for US workers is to make common cause with everyone their government is bombing and starving. So I find it hard to call that patriotic. Now I'm going to turn to what I think is the most important difference between 1914 and now, and that is fascism. And I think the left is, if anything, more confused on this than about imperialism. Yet fascism is fast emerging as the greatest modern threat to humanity. And we better wise up to it. Wake up and smell the zyklon. And why did that happen? Again, this is a historical thing. Fascism was born directly out of the Soviet victory. Up until then, the revolutionary wave of 1918 swept away the old order, the dynastic empires, Austria-Hungary, the Romanovs, and the Ottomans. Now, until then, the European bourgeoisie basically used landed classes, like the Prussian Junkers, to suppress the working class, and it itself was small enough that it didn't always command a popular majority. After 19, country after country had to concede suffrage, deal with social demands, inspired by the 1917 revolution. So imperialist strategy was then very straightforward, to divide the working class. And it did this by, it needed working class movements that would take its side. Now, in times of wealth, when it was doing well, it could rely on social democracy. But now, and in times of decay, it has to call on fascism. This was obscured by the post-1945 reconstruction of social democracy, but it rested on two conditions. The US warfare state had unleashed a new wave of capitalist expansion, and it was forced to defend its vassals against a new wave of revolutionary change. It had to tolerate the welfare state, which it hates. It is now, as soon as it had got rid of the Soviet Union, it launched a full frontal assault on it. There's a connection between those. It created buffer states in Germany, Japan, South Korea. But it could only do this when it had the wealth, which is now being exhausted, and it turns to fascism. What is fascism? It's a pro-capitalist working class movement organized to suppress the working class. To do this, it constructs a national identity or a religious identity that claims that one part of the working class is superior to the rest. It injects the racism that is already implicit in the imperial relationship to the rest of the world into its own country. So I think, therefore, a very profound error has to be dealt with among the left. And this is to suppose that these movements are working class just because workers support them. And we've seen this confusion around the convoy and things like that. I think it's utterly wrong. Every imperialist country had mass working class support when it was at war with other imperialist countries. Hitler and Mussolini had millions of working class supporters. What determines the fascist character of a movement is its political objective. So I also think it's very wrong, and we have to start thinking about how to deal with this, to say that the hallmark of fascism is anti-Semitism. So you get all these people saying Zelensky and the Azov battalion, they cannot be fascists because Kolomoisky is Jewish, Zelensky is Jewish. No, the characteristic of fascism, of course, anti-Semitism was its most horrific expression. I'm no way denying that, but fascism can seize on any target. Who is that target today? Russian people. That's the target of the new wave of fascism, of the new genocidal rhetoric we're seeing that is directed against all Russians and not just against so-called Russian dictators. So what do we need? I'm going to conclude on this. I don't know how much longer I've got. Looks like I've got a couple of minutes. Okay, we need
3 minutes, Alan.
That's beautiful. So we now need, in my opinion, a new socialism of the global north. That's our task. That's what this small group of people here, just like the small group of Bolsheviks, and there's of course small groups of people who are not in this room who have equally wonderful, ideas, but they have to create a new. So we have to work together to create a new socialism that can work with China, Russia, and the global South to recreate the international unity that the old socialists destroyed in 1914. And Marx gives us a double start point. He first of all said, no nation that enslaves another can ever itself be free, which means Ukraine will never be free as long as it oppresses its Russian and other linguistic minorities. And then he said, labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself where the black skin is branded. So labor in the imperialist countries has a double obligation. Abroad, it must defend the workers of the world against their own capitalists. And at home, it must advance the cause of the whole working class, above all the oppressed, who are not only the chief target of fascism, but generally speaking, the most politically advanced. That is, we need a world working class alliance against imperialism and fascism. So I'm going to make a few concluding remarks that I may not finish. First of all, I think that we can no longer define this movement by rejecting what is called reformism. I think that's an old polarization we should get rid of. Some of the most revolutionary leaders of the post-war, of the pre-First World War period, were also the people who capitulated first to imperialism. Ferdinand Lassalle in Germany, Hindman in Britain, who violently supported the British in the Boer War. They were examples of this, basically social patriotism. And they were the most extreme revolutionaries. Hindman led the British Socialist Party out of the Labour Party because he said it didn't engage in enough class struggle. Yet he was the first to betray. So I think we have to get rid of this idea that reformism is our distinguishing point. No, what's our distinguishing point is intransigence. We don't give up. We stick by our guns, especially in defending the global South. The second point, I think there is a far-right sniping criticism of woke culture. And this permeates also the left. I think this has no place in our movement. The working class can only unite if it defends everyone oppressed by its capitalists. I think the historic response to George Floyd's murder was absolutely fundamental because it was dawning on young white Americans that they were no better off than the descendants of slaves. This has laid the foundations of a future American socialism worthy of the name. If you cast that understanding away, you kick open the door to fascism. I make a final point, which is just really for something to discuss. I think a historic mistake was made when the Communist International was wound up in 1944. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it basically condemned the communists to exist only in their national context, when you have this constant drip, drip pressure on them because they don't encounter the views of other people, like in the global South. So I think that we need a new international organization is needed. And this will be, I'm not saying we should do it. I'm just saying we should get a discussion going about it. I think this will be very different from any past international, and hopefully it won't be called the Sixth International. Let's give it a different name and stop the sequencing. But it is needed. And although I'm not saying we're going to launch it, I think one of the reasons we wrote the manifesto was to send a message to all the defenders of international working class unity that they should join together and give organized shape to that unity, which will take the form of international political organizations. That's it. I posted this on academia. I put a number of links to reading and sources that you may, I hope, find useful. And again, thank you very much. And one last plug: please give us money. Without that, there will be no international units because we won't be there, folks.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
Okay.
Radhika, do you have a point that you want to make, or?
I just wanted to, we forgot to arrange this earlier and I kept messaging you, but your attention was elsewhere, quite rightly. But I just wanted 2 minutes to say something about the International Manifesto Group before we go to the Q&A. So
Last speaker, we have Q still up.
Right, so you have Q. Right, so after that, please let me speak. Yeah.
Okay,
For 2
yeah,
minutes.
and so, thank you, Alan, for those remarks. I think you're absolutely right that, especially given today the interconnected nature of all the struggles, the fact that there isn't an international is it's needed. So I think you're onto something with your remarks, and hopefully we can discuss that more in the Q&A. So our final speaker is Q Anthony Omin. He's an award-nominated writer whose columns appear in Maclean's, The Globe and Mail, and he's the host of the Unredacted podcast with Glenn Greenwald. In addition, he's a board member of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists. You can find him on Twitter at QA Omin. So Q, go ahead.
How's it going? Oh, and I appreciate it. Just my surname is Omeni. It's okay. It's okay. You didn't know. People have only seen that in print.
I've only read it. I'm so sorry. I'll know now.
It's okay. I wouldn't expect people to know that. So the topic that I was actually gonna go with a different topic, but something just kept on pressing on my mind over the last couple of days, and that was a news article that I read showing that West and Central Africa are becoming increasingly food insecure, and I found that on the continent of Africa, I found that to be completely bizarre. And so I wanted to go over a few things, and I'm sorry that I don't have something pre-written. I'm going off of notes that I've made previously, so I hope you'll bear with me. But the idea of West Africa being food insecure was just so preposterous to me that I had to speak on this one. So this came from an article that I saw saying that the food crisis in West Africa, which has apparently been exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine, has already left 27 million people in West Africa in a state of hunger. Apparently, over the next few months, an additional 11 million people may end up becoming food insecure. So there was an NGO report that was published by Oxfam that said between 2007 and 2022, the amount of people in need of food assistance in countries like Mali, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad went up from 7 million to 27 million people. And apparently, if there is no emergency action taken, then we know how quickly the rest of the world, the developed world, springs to action whenever Africa is in need of aid. Unless emergency action is taken, the number could rise to 38 million people by June of this year. So the idea of a country or a set of countries, a country like Nigeria or a country like Mali or a country like Chad being food insecure, given the quality of the soil, given the types of food that can be produced in those countries, given the types of food that were produced in those countries, was amazing to me. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that the future of a sustainable world actually lies in Africa. For example, the most minerally rich country on the face of the planet, not minerally rich country in Africa or in the Eastern continents, but in the entire world, is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The DRC's untapped reserves for minerals such as cobalt, as everybody knows, cobalt and coltan being those rare earth metals that are increasingly being mined to pull electronics into our cell phones and electronic devices, but also tantalum and gold and copper, etc. The reserves amount to about $24 trillion. It is the most minerally rich country on the face of the planet. On the entire continent of Africa, there is enough potential for food productivity, for agriculture, that could feed the world 2 times over, could feed itself 2 times over and have enough for the rest of the world. Although the amount of arable land on the African continent is relatively small, given the total size of the continent, the types of food that can be produced has an incredibly wide variety. The soil is good for everything from wheat to cassava. Just about anything that you can plant in any other continent on Earth can be planted on the African continent. All of them together at once. Now, here's what bothers me a little bit. When people think of development on the African continent, they often think of things like infrastructure. They think of things like schools and hospitals, and that's good, except most African countries that have been in debt to the IMF, either currently or previously, have been unable to develop their own infrastructure because the initial loans that were taken out from the IMF were often for the purpose of building infrastructure. However, due to the onerous terms of those repayment conditions, oftentimes they find themselves barely able to service the interest on the principal, and then have to take out additional loans just to cover the interest, which adds additional interest to it. And then you see how the debt trap works. And in order to qualify for those additional loans to service the interest on the previous loans that were taken out to build infrastructure, oftentimes which didn't get built because in many cases they were built by kleptocratic and reactionary regimes that took the power back from the people and took it back from revolutionaries, took out additional loans for the purpose of infrastructure, but then spent it on themselves. Then the IMF, in many cases, ruled out the possibility of building infrastructure with any of those additional loans, and they're there for the purpose of servicing that debt. And what this has led to is a condition where there are relatively few paved roads and railways on the African continent, period. So, to give an example, the United States has 4 million miles of paved road. The United States, just one country. In the country of South Africa, there are just over 780,000 miles of paved road. That represents 90% of the paved road on the African continent, period. So, United States, 4 million miles in total. The entire African continent, less than 1 million miles of paved road, up to today. Here's the issue with agriculture on the African continent. One of the reasons why many African countries are food insecure is because there are so few paved roads in the remainder of these countries that are not South Africa, that fully half of the crops that are produced on the entire continent will spoil before they arrive at market. The roads are built to deliver goods from the place of origin, i.e. farms and mines, to ports. They are built for the purpose of moving goods from the resource-rich areas in the interior of Africa out to ports where they can be shipped to other countries. The idea that any country in the African continent should have to depend on wheat supplies from Russia and Ukraine is itself preposterous, because wheat is not only a staple crop that requires intensive forms of agriculture that will actually deplete the soil. There are many other staple crops that can be planted on the continent, but they're dependent on wheat because in many cases, the paved roads for the purpose of delivering foods such as nightshades, for example, tubers like sweet potatoes and yams, etc., cassava. Well, they have a limited shelf life. You can't store sweet potatoes in a silo the way that you would store grains in a silo. They will go bad very quickly. So they often spoil. And then countries in Africa then depend on grain shipments from outside of the continent because they keep for a longer period of time. So half of the goods are spoiling before they even get to market. The second biggest barrier that did exist until last year was that there were massive trade barriers between each of the countries. So if, let's say, Kenya was facing a food shortage crisis, and then there was a surplus of goods in Uganda that could be shipped to Kenya, well, one of the biggest obstacles was the trade barrier. Well, In 2021, January of 2021, all but one of the other countries on the African continent engaged in a free trade pact. That is, all of them are able to move goods from one country to another without those onerous trade barriers. Problem with that is, how do you actually get the goods from one country to another if you don't have railways and you don't have paved roads? So what's then required for to move goods from one place to the other is obviously to take out infrastructure loans. Well, when the IMF has already indicated that they will not offer you loans for the purpose of infrastructure, they will offer you loans for paying off your previously existing debts. And in exchange for that, they're going to require you to sell off your parastatal entities. So I'm thinking, for example, of a country like Zambia. Zambia was one of the most, if not the most, copper-rich countries in the entire world. The issue with Zambia is that during the OPEC crisis of the 1970s, Zambia, along with countries like what was then called Zaire, Ghana, and other countries that were dependent on metal exports, well, their economies cratered because no oil sales, no automobiles, no planes being built, etc., no transportation vehicles being built, well, then no need for the metals that make up their bodies in the first place. So the problem was the export markets for metals on the African continent absolutely collapsed. And this is a situation from which many of these countries have never recovered. In order to qualify for those loans, Zambia was required, for example, to sell off its public broadcaster, was required to sell off several hospitals, was required to partially privatize its education system. And every subsequent government that has tried to recover from this disaster in the mid to late 1970s has not recovered since. Successive governments have not been able to overcome the onerous loan conditions and the repayment conditions that were imposed on them by the original IMF loan. Right now, Zambia is applying for and will likely receive another round of IMF loans, and the already stripped down to the bare bones government apparatus that exists now is going to have to further restructure itself in order to qualify for these loans. Why is it going back to the IMF? Well, apparently, Zambia was trapped in a debt-trapped diplomatic relationship with China. And this is what many Western sources have been saying to casual viewers and readers and listeners, that China is engaged in debt-trap diplomacy with the African continent. Okay, so the question is, well, what does that mean? What is China doing exactly? What are they doing on the continent? Well, I'm going to give you an example of another country that has actually been engaged in heavy trade and financing with the African continent, and that's India. So the India Export and Import Bank, or the Exim Bank, between the years of 2009 and 2019, provided $12.4 billion of transaction to sub-Saharan Africa. And that was mostly for the purpose of either infrastructure loans or repaying previously existing debts. China had roughly about 5 times that amount. And you know what China did not do during the course of the negotiations for these payments? Well, if you read Financial Times or the Financial Post or Foreign Policy or The Economist or any of these papers, they will say that these are all resource-backed loans, which, I mean, obviously, usually if you take out a loan, there is some sort of a collateral that you will possibly put up. Now, the question is whether the financial entity that offers you the loan in exchange for this or exchange for putting up of the collateral is actually going to seize that collateral. So we'll hear stories about, for example, China was planning on seizing a Ugandan airport or seizing a Kenyan airport or seizing Kenyan ports, or all number of scary possible Chinese seizures of African infrastructure projects that never ended up materializing. Well, why wouldn't they do that? Well, if you are a banking entity and you are known for viciously seizing, like appropriating the collateral. So let's say if you were a lender and somebody put up their home because they needed to redo their back decks or they needed to do their roofing or anything of that nature. So you take out, let's say, a $10,000 or a $15,000 loan to do your home renovations, and you find yourself into some financial trouble. Let's say COVID hit, you're not able to pay back the line of credit on the schedule that you promised that you're going to. Well, I mean, unfortunately, many people were hit with financial difficulties due to COVID. So what did banks do for the most part? Were they out seizing homes left, right, and center? No. The public opinion against those banks would have been detrimental. What they did instead was renegotiate the loan conditions, which is exactly what China did. Renegotiate the loan conditions possibly offer additional financing if it was necessary, offer some loan forgiveness, or at least a holiday on repaying the principal until those countries could recover from COVID. Did this happen with Western countries? No, it didn't. At least I should say not for the most part. Did China renegotiate the loan conditions? Yes, they absolutely did. And now the issue is that for the most part, African countries have been increasingly turning to China and India in order to develop infrastructure, i.e. building roads and railroads so they can deliver not only goods domestically within the countries, but also in between the countries. So for example, one of the larger projects that is happening in Ghana right now is that there are 2 rail projects from Ghanaian ports to the Burkinabe capital of Ouagadougou. There are multiple rail projects. There was a high-speed rail project that was just completed in Nigeria. And another one that is moving from Abuja, from the nation's capital, out to rural areas. Why? Well, for the purpose of delivering farm and agricultural goods and mineral goods to the country's capital and to city centers. So the reason we've been hearing about this debt trap diplomacy is not only to demonize China, but also to infantilize African countries and say they should not be able to qualify for loans. They should not have any sense of self-determination on their country's own development unless it's on our terms. And what they have to give up in exchange is not simply paying back the interest, but they should actually hand us their hospitals and public broadcasters. They should privatize their schools, and they should let our agricultural products and our finished consumer products, our retail products, etc. We should be able to dump our surplus into their country, and they should be able to say nothing about it. We should be able to dump our trash, dump our recycling into their countries, and their environmental agencies can do absolutely nothing about it. As a matter of fact, why do they even have environmental agencies? Let's just dismantle those altogether.
You just said
here's another
under 2 minutes, Q.
Sure thing. Now here's one final issue I want to get through in this. One of the largest complaints, which is an absolute lie that I've seen, not only passed around by people on social media, et cetera, but also by again those major publications, Financial Times, the Foreign Policy Magazine, The Economist, et cetera, is that Chinese workers are actually displacing African workers. That is absolutely not true. The peak amount of Chinese workers that were ever on the African continent was somewhere in the range of about 22,000 workers, and it's been decreasing steadily since 2017. Why? Because what was happening in countries like Ethiopia, for example, where some rail projects were being built, is that the conductors and also the engineers that were putting the tracks together, they needed fully trained experts to be able to embark on these projects. What they did in exchange was actually educate Ethiopian workers such that people who were educated either in China or in Ethiopia that could take over these projects once they reached completion, when they were fully trained and then apprenticed, then Chinese workers would be able to return home, and then the Ethiopian workers could be able to take on the projects by themselves. What ended up happening? Lo and behold, maybe the Chinese workers left. Chinese workers are increasingly leaving from countries like Nigeria and Ghana and Uganda and Ethiopia, et cetera. There's an increasing drawdown. What they've done is what was mentioned in a report that I saw with June Afrique just a couple of weeks ago. China wants to send scholars and engineers to Africa, i.e. educate their own. We are not interested in sending guns to Africa. So the next time that you see somebody saying that the African continent is being colonized by the Chinese or by anybody else, really, the immediate response that you probably want to come up with is, why is it that Africa cannot decide for itself? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Q. And yeah, it is very infantilizing towards African countries for them not being able to decide themselves. That's a very good point. So we're going to move to our Q&A, but first I think Radhika wanted to say a few words. And then if people want to just limit the discussion in the chat and just try to, because we don't have the Q&A box, just try to keep it like questions for now if you can. And I don't know how long we'll go on here because it's approaching 2 hours already. And I don't know how long speakers want to stay around, but we'll keep it quick. Anyway, Radhika, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Brandon. And I just wanted to say very quickly, if you like what you heard today here, if you liked the general idea that the West and the world needs a new left, a left that is determinedly anti-imperialist, that doesn't fall for the ruses of imperialism today, a left that is at the same time committed to looking be inclusivity, that is to say, understands that just while you cannot do a class without diversity, the working class itself is very diverse, etc. If you understand all these things and you want to contribute to the goal of creating a new left, the International Manifesto Group is one of the organizations that is trying to do just that. I've just put the link there. At this link, you will find a brief background about ourselves, the manifesto itself, which I very much urge you all to please read and consider signing. It's not very long, it's about 8,000 words, and considering the ground it covers, it's a pretty rewarding 1 hour read, if we say so ourselves. So please consider reading, signing, disseminating. There is also a donate button. As Alan says, we have a Patreon account. And finally, please also consider volunteering. We do have various committees that are doing a lot of work and work like putting these programs together. So please consider doing that as well. Thank you very much. Oh, and I should simply say, I should have identified myself first. I'm Radhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group.
So I guess I'm not sure if anyone else has seen any other questions. I saw one for Alan. So maybe, and I guess I'm seeing some hands, but I'll just start with this question I saw in the chat. So it's for Alan. How do we reconcile our rejection of the far right sniping at woke culture with the Russian state's close engagement, to say the least, with the subculture in the West?
Yeah, sure. I think that's an extremely important question. I mean, I've been engaging with Russian politics since 1987. And the existence of a far-right current in Russia is beyond dispute. I don't know if anybody noticed, but Zhirinovsky, who I've personally encountered on a couple of occasions, who was one of the most outspoken leaders of the fascist tendency within Russia, died a week ago. I think he was unlamented. And there is a tendency, which I feel should be engaged with, to accept the Trump-type criticism of woke culture. What has happened in the last 2 months is that this tendency is completely reversed. The RT, for a period, went through a dreadful period, right? That's gone. You just go and look at RT now, it's completely changed compared with what it was 2 months ago. Talking even to individuals who were susceptible to far-right arguments, their ideas are changing because they understand that the unity of the Russian people and the unity of any working people requires that they don't beat up on people. There is a set of ultimately, I think the real reason why fascism is influential, not so much in Russia, but in France and in the United States of America, because I think Trump is the leader, in my opinion, of a fascist current, and that's what we should be talking about, is the failure of the left. It's very straightforward. I mean, I think one of the reasons that the truckers' convoy in Canada caused so much confusion on the left is because, and you know, we had a big discussion about it, and people said, well, look, they're dealing with issues that workers are affected by. There's been a catastrophic failure of the COVID policies, and I'm broadening the sense of the left to include the Liberal Party in that. Okay, so they failed. Well, if you fail, the right steps in. So then you need tactics for dealing with that. I think that the most sophisticated tactics are the tactics of Mélenchon in France. I think that we should study and engage with Mélenchon because Mélenchon's party is the only party I know in Europe, maybe in Greece, who's actually taken a consistently anti-NATO position and has a growing mass base. I think in the first round of the elections, they went up to 23%, right? And they're they are in direct competition with Le Pen, okay? So they could have simply said, we want you to vote for Macron to keep Le Pen out. They didn't say that. They said no votes for Le Pen. And then they launched a big consultation amongst their members about how they wanted to vote, whether they wanted to abstain, whether they wanted to vote for Macron and so on, and what they thought was important, which then injected their demands into the second round of the presidential election. I think what that tactic was directed at doing is breaking people away from Le Pen, who were drawn to Le Pen because they felt there was no alternative. So that the most important thing to do is to show that there's an alternative. And the most effective way to fight the far-right currents that exist within Russian society, to which, by the way, I think it's rubbish that Putin is a fascist. He has nothing to do with these people. He keeps them well at bay. And at no times I felt that Putin himself is prone to this kind of stuff. But the best way is to demonstrate practically that it's possible to count on a section of Western society to oppose what our governments are doing in the war. And if we can demonstrate that the left is actually the most reliable anti-war force that is capable of bringing these crazy guys to heel and to negotiate a settlement, which is what is needed, then I think that will have an influence within Russian society, because they've basically given up on the Western left. And I can't say I do blame them. I can't say I can't blame them. It's due to a lack of understanding. But the most practical thing we have to do to overcome that is build a war movement that actually holds our own capitalists to account and stops them beating up on Russians. Then I think you will find that the atmosphere will change. And from my discussions that are going on now with people in Russia, that change is already going on.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. Someone has their hand up. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Novacha, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, please. Thank you. Great presentations. Just if I can, from the position of, let's say, Eastern Europe politically or Southern Europe geographically, still in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, there's also colonial designation of Western Balkans. Anyway, so in this position, anti-Western resentment is quite to say toxic for the leftist position. So if I could propose some sort of subtitle, Western middle class left. So not middle class in terms of people that are in charge of it, but more like left that is blind, structurally blind, or openly oriented towards protection of the interest of middle classes of core capitalist economies. Why it is important? Somebody mentioned the division between social democrats and communists before Second World War. But social democrats were more gathering better paid workers that were closer to middle class status. So it is very important.
I'm going to watch.
Yeah. Also later, we can say for today's situation, what it resembles us for, it resembles that all European bourgeoisies, which is to say middle classes, were in fact supporting a Nazi cause in Second World War. Like not Polish or Czech ones that were like materially disabled, but all bourgeoisies were into like supporting Nazis' cause in the East because it was too big a spoil to share after possible destruction of Soviet Union, whatever state of socialist identity of it. Okay, just a proposal. It is more like middle class left. Then, like if we go, I disagree with Alan that it was working class project fascism. Not at all. I mean, they had to gather some working class, which was primarily disorganized working class from like northern, from Prussia in Germany, from villages in Italy. Working class organizations in itself and for themselves were the first victims of fascist dictatorialship rule in Italy or Nazis in Germany. So it was middle class movement that was through pseudo-revolutionary rhetorics managed to somehow deceive or simply by violence include parts of disorganized working class. And then later when it it became what we call totalitarianism, which is another story. It just managed to involve them into the imperial project, but not the working class movement. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not sure if anyone wants to respond to that. I'm not sure if there was a question or if it was necessarily.
Well, Kim has her hand up, so maybe
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if you can see the hands, but Kim has a.
I can't see that one. So Kim, you can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this session and everybody. What my question is that given a lot of the podcasts that people are looking for answers, I find it very confusing for people when they hear somebody who's really strong, like Chris Hedges, who really criticized the American system internally, but comes off with very strong language against Russia and the war in Ukraine and all this. So it confuses people, right? So there's one thing I wanted to ask the panelists how they feel about, folks like that who have very strong, good podcasts on the one hand, but on the other hand, kind of come up against China or Russia or whatever during the war. And then the second point is that, does anybody have an opinion on the Progressive International? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kim. So maybe the best way, not every speaker who spoke can have an opportunity to answer, but maybe we'll go in reverse order. And if you don't feel like you have anything to say, you can just skip. So I'll start with Q if you want to respond to that.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. I'll be perfectly honest. My attention was elsewhere. I was distracted. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I guess it was mostly regarding people who have podcasts like Chris Hedges, for instance, who maybe come out strong on criticizing like America's internal domestic policies, but have weak like imperialist views in terms of the.
Oh well, I don't really.
I guess
I don't really blame somebody like Chris Hedges for that. You have to understand, like, he's not a socialist. Chris Hedges is a Presbyterian minister. And while he has, I think, fairly cogent critiques of American politics, domestic policy, it's also because, his theological and like academic training would have been in anti-poverty. But it's also a ministry that fairly well accords with U.S. foreign policy. So that's very much where he's coming from. Just because you agree with his domestic takes doesn't mean you have to agree with his foreign policy takes. Also, like, you don't normally see very many committed socialists, or I mean, I'm just a communist. I'll say communist, but you don't really see communists with a very large platform. So not much you can expect. And I think it's a bit self-defeating to expect that people who don't share our politics are going to suddenly start adopting our politics. I don't blame them for it. I think the only response to that is to start, if it's a matter of like pitching articles to editors, whether or not you think that they're going to be accepted. I think a lot of us get into this mindset that, well, if I pitch to this publication or that publication, they're never going to publish it anyway because they don't publish communists. Well, you never know until you try, right? So pitching articles, if you have like a background of understanding or research in a particular area, then try like making your own video essay and publishing it. I think personally, independent media is going to be the only path forward, because expecting that mainstream media sources are suddenly going to start adopting our positions when their financial and class interests are would compel them in the opposite direction, it's just never going to happen. I think one last thing I want to say on that is that Gramsci in his prison notebooks was very adamant that there isn't simply one class of intellectual. There's not one type of intellectual. We sometimes get into the habit of getting wrapped up in the idea of intellectualism and academia as this grand debate. And so there's things you can take from academics and things you can leave, which is entirely true. You also have to understand who intellectuals are operating on behalf of. So when you see a defense industry expert or a foreign policy expert or a disinformation expert or whoever show up on MSNBC or CNN or wherever, these are intellectuals that are working on behalf of the bourgeois class. I mean, that's what they're there to do. That's what they're paid for. And so expecting them to start changing their opinions and start telling the truth because they're supposed to be honest academics, I mean, it's just never going to happen. So the only The only alternative to that is to develop a cadre of intellectuals working on behalf of the proletariat. And frankly, there's many of us, not just that are on panel, but are watching in the audience, that can fill that purpose. So let's work on that. Let's work on developing our own intellectual class and work on supporting independent media rather than waiting for mainstream orgs and mainstream pundits to come around.
Thanks, Q. Before I let the next speaker talk on that question, I think I'll just let Bill Mayer had his hand up. We'll let him speak, and then that way the panelists going forward can answer either Kim's question or Bill's or both. So Bill, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much for this amazing meeting. This is great speakers and one of my very favorites I've ever seen. Thank you for your work. This organization is one of the best. I have a lot of questions, but I'm only going to ask one. Maybe somebody on the panel can address it. It's just curious to me why, in regards to the Ukrainian situation, why Putin went in to denazify the country, and yet there's many supporters around the world, far right supporters who support Putin, like Marie Le Pen and Trump and other right leaders. So it sort of seems to be contradictory to me. I'm just curious if anybody would be willing to address that politics of fascism and Nazism and Putin.
Thank you for that question. So maybe Q, if you want to take a stab at that again, or I can just skip to Alan. It's up to you.
Well, there's surely other people.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, let someone else take a shot at this one.
Sure. Is Alan, or maybe, well, you just answered a question. Maybe
I've already spoken, so I see if somebody else.
Or anyone else interested?
Brandon, is it all right if I come in on a couple of things? Because I actually need to go pretty soon. So
absolutely, come in.
If it's all right, I'll respond to a couple of things that have come up in the discussion. And also there was something on the chat that I wanted to come in on. So yeah, on the chat, a couple of people were talking about China's role in the Philippines and China acting in an aggressive way in the South China Sea. And I just wanted to come in on that because this is something that even in the kind of anti-imperialist left is not very well understood. And like with everything, you have to look at the broader context. And the broader context here is that ever since 1949, ever since the establishment of the PRC, the US and its allies under the Truman Doctrine has maintained a kind of a laser-sharp focus on encircling China, containing China, with the ultimate goal of rolling back the Chinese Revolution and bringing China back to its natural home, in a subservient position within the imperialist world system. And that included and continues to include a number of measures. So the development of the first island chain, which included Japan, Taiwan, the northern Philippines, cultivating pro-US governments throughout the region, trying to put pressure on China, trying to create choke points such that the US, if it chose to, could impose a suffocating embargo on China and use that to pressure China economically and strategically. So for China, yeah, the importance of the China Sea, the South China Sea, has always been strategic rather than economic. All of these divisions, these hostilities, these problems, they're not about the profits from the fishing industry in the Scarborough Shoal. They're about China's survival. It's about frustrating the US's plans to bring China back under its control. So, and more broadly, these issues have got their origins in the long-term struggle between a decaying imperialism and a rising socialism, and which has been at the forefront of global politics since 1917. The Philippines for decades in particular was very, very willing to do the US's bidding. It was kind of the quintessential, the Marcos regime was the quintessential US proxy. And Duterte, actually, for whatever one might think of his administration and its domestic policy, actually started to make a historic break in terms of shifting the Philippines away from being a puppet regime and moving towards better relations with China. And that's really significant. Border disputes over fishing rights, disputes over who controls what remote island, etc. You can find these things all around the world, right? There were very complicated overlapping claims around the Arctic Circle in the North Pole, essentially, with Canada, Denmark, Russia, the US unable to agree over who runs what. Those disputes can be resolved within the context of international law with reference to the UN Charter, as long as you don't have external forces deliberately stoking confrontation, hostility, and division. And that's exactly what the US is trying to do in terms of China and the Philippines, to leverage divisions, deepen divisions, with the purpose of expanding and consolidating US hegemony. So we should support China, we should support the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, resolving their issues on the basis of dialogue and negotiation, without interference, without provocation. Just on the Progressive International quickly, which Dr. Kim brought up, it's a diverse group. I guess it's built from social democratic movements. It's made some tentative steps in the direction of anti-imperialism, and I strongly support that. And I support the idea ultimately of working with everyone that's willing to play some role in the struggle against imperialism, against white supremacy, against patriarchy. And sometimes we have to sort of put differences aside, unite where we can around specific key issues. For example, opposing the new Cold War, or opposing racism, or working on environmental issues. I think the most prominent figure within the Progressive International is Yanis Varoufakis. His analysis is based on a theory of democracy, which, as far as I can see, exists entirely within a framework of capitalist liberalism. He considers China as authoritarian, as a dictatorship, and so on. He talks about standing with the Uyghurs, standing with Hong Kong, etc. I don't agree with him on all of that, but to the extent that he's willing to stand up to the insanity of Cold War, to the extent that he's willing to stand up to NATO and this kind of bloc confrontation that the US is fomenting, I think it's absolutely essential that we work together with him and other similar forces on these issues. Lastly, Russia, Ukraine, fascism. This is a really important issue, and we could have another separate webinar devoted entirely to this. I think there's a lot of confusion, because it's absolutely true that while there is a very significant problem with fascism and anti-Semitic and white supremacist forces in Ukraine, you also have some pretty unsavory right-wing forces in Russia. And actually, a lot of people use this, the existence of those forces, as an excuse not to support Russia, or to kind of denounce Russia, and to essentially side with NATO, side with the US, side with the West in its attack on Russia. And they use the same rationale for saying, well, we don't support the people in the Donbass, we don't support people in Donetsk, we don't support people in Lugansk, because they have some right-wing, some racist elements within them as well. And that's all interesting and complex, and we can talk about it, but you have to look at the overall picture. What you have in Ukraine is an alliance of kind of pro-EU, pro-NATO liberalism in a strategic alliance with fascism, with outright white supremacism and anti-Semitism, with an overall project of expanding US hegemony, expanding US imperialism, consolidating and expanding NATO, as against a rising multipolarity represented by the rise of China and the re-emergence of Russia and their alliances with countries like Iran, countries like South Africa, with the progressive countries of Latin America and so on. That's the big picture. So regardless of which particular group in which particular place has which particular politics, the key question to ask is, which side are you on in a historic global struggle between imperialism and multipolarity? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Brandon, can I say something? Brandon?
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
This is really interesting. Thank you very much for what you were saying, Carlos. I'd like to give you a view from Latin America about the Russia-Ukraine thing. Latin America has seen this in many ways, because we tend to understand that what is happening in Ukraine has happened in Latin America because they overthrew the elected government, put in this puppet fellow, and he is an instrument of the U.S. imperialism. I think that there is no confusion when they were voting in the in the UN, so many of the non-aligned countries refused to vote Russia off the council because they understood what is happening. Most of the non-aligned nations in the UN are, it's not that they want the war, it's not that they think, great, Russia going in there and doing that, but they're not going to go against Russia because they understood that Russia was the victim here, had been, the Russian people had been for 8 years complaining and nobody listened to them. The other thing to remember is that in Latin America, at least in Venezuela, we are looking at what they have done, what the United States has done to us historically, and what Russia and China has done for us. In the most horrendous moment of depth, despair, and need of Venezuela, it was Russia and China. Well, apart from Cuba, of course, but Russia and China with all their might, with all their wealth, with everything they could, and defending us from the United States, who came to Venezuela's help. We would not have survived the pandemic if it hadn't been for Russia and China. We would not have been able to sell a drop of our oil if it hadn't been for China, if it hadn't been for Iran that has put so much risk in supporting us. And what am I saying? I am saying that this isn't globalization. This is something so dear to socialists, which is international solidarity. And these nations, Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, have shown with different governments that they have, that they have, not all, like the Venezuelan government, they have shown international solidarity. So when the main media spouts out what Trump is saying and upon is saying, people in Venezuela say, well, who the hell are they? And what have they done for us? And they're a bunch of liars and we don't care what they say. Who is going to pay any attention to what that lunatic and dangerous lunatic Trump is saying? So Russia is not alone. I know that the whole media, I live in Canada, and this is just horrendous. The horrendous propaganda that's going on here, the CBC and everything. They make it look as if Russia and China are some sort of parias, that nobody wants anything to do with them. Well, excuse me, 3/4 of the world does want something to do with Cuba and with China, because they have shown dignity and they have shown respect for so many of our countries. So I say to those who are listening to Trump, don't listen to them. They're on the wrong side of history. They will not prevail. And I venture to say that the poor misbegotten people of Ukraine and their poor president who parades around thinking he's some sort of Churchill, they don't realize what dupes they are, how they have been used and abused by US imperialism to fight their country. There is Biden saying, oh yeah, go and fight, you Ukrainians, to the last man, because that's what we want you to do, to kill each other. And the European Union could not be more stupider. Already there was First World War, Second World War, all played out and destroyed Europe. Now they're on the verge of, we're going to have a third world war. And guess where that war is going to be? Is it going to be in New York? Is it going to be in California? It's going to be in Europe. And they are being used, and they are too stupid or stubborn to pull away from the US imperialism, which I think and I hope and for everything that I see, most of the non-aligned countries of the UN are pulling away from this wretched, bloodthirsty imperialism.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. That's an excellent answer. And I think, we can't be Eurocentric when we look at this issue and not just focus on the responses of Trumps and their like. Do any other speakers want to take a go at this question, or?
Well, Radhika has her hand up, but then if
Sure.
when she's done, I could have a go if you want.
Absolutely. Radhika, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, gosh, I mean, this has been such an intellectual feast, as so many people have pointed out in the chat. So I just wanted to make a couple of points, perhaps, and invite the speakers to respond if they wish. But here goes. So the first thing is that I wanted to say somebody raised a very interesting and complex question of figures like George Galloway and others who tend to take good positions on imperialism, but are quite awful on certain issues relating to racism, misogyny, etc., etc. And I've been thinking hard about this, and I guess this is where I've come, and I invite your comments. Basically, what we are living through right now is a situation in which there's a ruling class, which I call a social neoliberal ruling class. So essentially, they involve, their position involves a combination of neoliberal economic policy and then a smattering of diversity-related policies that are entirely liberal. So, you know, their feminism is about promoting a small number of women to high positions. Their anti-racism is about promoting a small number of non-white people, while the bulk of the non-white people and women, for example, remain at the bottom of the social scale. So now, and because this is the position of the establishment, a lot of people experience it as coming from top down, where governments and corporations are imposing a certain type of woke culture, and some people react in a knee-jerk fashion to this. And I think what we need to say to that is that basically this kind of woke culture doesn't do anything for ordinary people. So what we need is genuine feminism, anti-racism, the support for sexual minorities, etc., etc. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I really also wanted to say very much that I also wanted to plug the work of Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, which totally connect with what Q was talking about, what Anthony Omim was talking about, and that is that essentially, why is it that third world countries, which are objectively so rich, are in fact so poor? Why the countries are rich, but the people are poor? And what the Patnaiks have emphasized is one of the key ways in which imperialism functions is to essentially cheapen the value, or rather, let me rephrase that, essentially use the fact that tropical countries are actually capable of producing vastly more than they produce. They're capable of manufacturing vastly more agriculture, etc., but they are forced into essentially cash crop production and so on, which essentially reduces their productive capacity. It prevents them from diversifying their production, etc. So this is a key mechanism of imperialism. And finally, I just wanted to say that basically, I think that these conversations are really important, but they're also very urgent, because increasingly we are witnessing a situation in which Western imperialism is definitely receding. You can also see, for example, in the present crisis. I mean, we saw what happened in Afghanistan. In the present crisis, the West's attempt and the US's attempt to try to bring everybody, to scare everybody in the world to subordinating itself to the United States, is actually accelerating the division of the world into a camp centered on a decaying capitalism headquartered in the United States and a prospering socialism headquartered in China. And I think that this is why, as Carlos says, you got to decide which side you're on. And I think this is a critically important decision. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. So I think we'll try to wrap up at 2:30. So we probably have time for maybe another round of questions. And I think I saw that Hira Singh had your hand up. If you want to go ahead.
Hi, I put Frehiwet. It's not Hira. I'm with him. And could I ask? I want to thank first Professor Desai and Professor Freeman for your such pivotal contribution. It's very, very inspiring, because in this moment of demoralization and very disturbing time, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate also all the presenters. I learned a lot. So my question is about the role of China and India. I think I felt like there is a little bit of romanticism that China and India will be kind of different to Africans. as the presentations, earlier presentations show that racism and the marginalization of Black people and Africans is globalized, okay? And we are operating with this very unequal global world. And what is the likelihood of these two giant countries will be, really enlightened and really genuinely create an alternative path by treating Africans differently? Because, Africa has been, people of African descent have been marginalized because of colonization, slavery, and the continual racism. And, and the whole continent, except South Africa and a little bit of the Maghreb regions, are, the Black African population has been, underdeveloped by war even, even the indigenous craft industries have been destroyed. I'm Ethiopian and I come from that country. We have seen 50 years of war and destruction. And the Second World War, fascism, literally, as Mussolini said, Ethiopia this time with the people, Abyssinia this time with the people or without the people. He almost conquered it without the people. My grandparents were all massacred at that time. And so I'm just concerned that because there is a big vacuum because of what Europe and the US and others have done, there's a vacuum in Africa. So any foreign other emerging countries can walk in freely with very little resistance because the civil society is destroyed. So what is the likelihood of that China and India can really contribute differently? And I know sorry, I'm taking too much time. I know that during the non-aligned movement, India and Ethiopia had very good relations. I love India. India has a lot to offer. Even India has been victimized because I feel so sad to hear anyone saying India is poor. India is.
I'll give it to the speakers to answer. I think that's probably enough for them to work with. Sorry to cut you off, but
thank you very much.
We're running low on time.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Does anyone? We haven't heard from maybe Ben.
Well, Nick Waslin has had his hand up periodically.
Sure.
Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, Nick, go ahead, and then we'll have the speakers answer.
Thank you. I just wrote my question down. Is it okay if I just send it in the chat?
It might be better just to repeat it quickly if you can. Okay. Or
all right. Well, first off, I want to thank you all so much. I have two really quick questions. Obviously, the left is torn on whether. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, the left is torn on whether this war in Ukraine is an imperialist war or not. It doesn't seem like that is the opinion here, and I'm glad to see that. But can you please speak about how to properly position oneself on this war, as I'm finding it hard to find my own footing? And the second question, as Ben mentioned earlier, efforts to sell wars to Western populations need to be boosted when it comes to leftist or more critical thinking audiences. Sorry, can you speak to what role fact-checking sites like factchecking.org or Snopes play in those efforts? I have often felt they act like a net or trampoline to catch or redirect these audiences back into pro-war positions. And do you know any sources that address this? Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. So maybe we'll start, Ben, if you want to go ahead. We haven't heard from you in a while to answer those questions.
Yeah, both are great questions. So I'll respond to both. First, the question about imperialism and the war in Ukraine. Second, about fact-checking websites. I'll start with the fact-checking websites because it's shorter, and I'll say that a lot of these so-called fact-checking websites have a revolving door with mainstream corporate media, and basically what they do is they take topics and they fact-check those topics with the claims of the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's their basis. It operates very similar to Wikipedia, and you can look at Wikipedia. It has a list of what it calls credible sources, and among those credible sources are, of course, all mainstream outlets and US government CIA propaganda websites like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or Voice of America. And then they blacklist all independent websites, especially in the global south. So Telesur, RT, Press TV, Chinese media, anything that challenges Western propaganda is not considered a reputable source. That's exactly how Snopes and these other outlets work. And by the way, I want to stress that there's a cottage industry of European so-called fact-checking websites, many of which were created during and after the Euromaidan coup backed by the US and Ukraine in 2014. And many of those outlets are funded by the United States and European governments, including there's one, I think it's called Euro Disinfo, and it's focused on so-called Russian disinformation. And they take money from Western governments to spread propaganda, basically claiming that anything that is an objective fact about what the US and NATO have done in Europe and Eastern Europe in particular is so-called Russian disinfo. I mean, this is part and parcel of Western corporate media. It's a propaganda apparatus. I remember Snopes had a so-called fact check where they claimed that the fact that the US government armed Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups in Syria was considered false and a crazy conspiracy theory. And as their so-called fact check, they quoted a New York Times article that said it's false. I mean, that the actual fact checking they do is laughably infantile and superficial. Now, as for the war,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, as for the war in Ukraine and imperialism, I mean, we need to have a scientific understanding of what imperialism is. Imperialism is a world system. And if you look at how the imperialist system operates, Russia is at best a semi-peripheral power. We've discussed this in previous sessions held by the International Manifesto Group. And, you know, I had a similar presentation where I talked about this question. In short, I would say, I mean, look at Russia's economy. Russia's economy is largely based on exports, and it's based on exports of raw materials and semi-processed materials. I mean, the vast majority of Russia's exports are fossil fuels, minerals, and fertilizers and wheat. This is not a country whose economy is based on exporting capital. Countries that export capital they tend to be the imperialist countries. That's the scientific understanding of imperialism. Russia is a semi-peripheral country, and that status is reflected in the fact that Russia is part of the BRICS system, that is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That means that, you know, Russia is very clearly, its economy is at a similar level as the Chinese economy, the Indian economy, the Brazilian economy, or the South African economy. These are not imperialist economies. As for the war in Ukraine itself, let's not forget that it was not Russia that started this war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine began in 2014 when the US government backed a violent coup in which far-right forces, including neo-Nazis, played a key role as the muscle in that coup in February 2014, overthrowing the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. And let's not forget that we have a leaked recording of top US diplomat Victoria Nuland handpicking who the leaders of the Ukrainian government would be after that coup. She specifically said, Yats is our guy. Yats was a shortened version of the name of Yatsenyuk, who became the prime minister. He was a right-wing, complete neoliberal Chicago boy who became the prime minister of Ukraine mere days after the US-backed coup in February 2014. And the US-backed coup regime in Ukraine proceeded to carry out brutal repression against the Russian-speaking population in the East, violating their rights to speak Russian in schools and media, and of course, and making it illegal to be a communist in Ukraine, making it illegal to use communist symbols or sing the Internationale. You can be imprisoned for several years for doing any of those things. And that set off a civil war in Ukraine in 2014. And between 2014 and 2022, when this February 24th, when Russia intervened, in those 8 years, according to the United Nations, 14,000 Ukrainians died in this civil war, and the vast majority of civilian casualties were caused by the Ukrainian government backed by NATO and the paramilitary groups, including neo-Nazis, that it has sponsored, such as the Azov Regiment, which was incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard after the coup. So we need to understand that the Ukrainian government has been directly integrated into this imperialist system. The Ukrainian government, not only that was installed by a coup, has been taking orders from Washington, but also the Ukrainian military saw a series of restructurings that was directly based on the idea of interoperability. And as recently as November 2021, just a few months before the Russian intervention, the Ukrainian military and these fascist paramilitary groups were doing military exercises with NATO with an emphasis on military interoperability. That means integration with NATO. So the idea that this is a war between a small, plucky Ukrainian resistance and this big Russian bear, that's absolutely nonsense. What we're actually seeing is a proxy war, and NATO is part and parcel of the imperialist world system led by the US and NATO. And that's not just my view. I mean, we even have right-wing war hawks who are US government officials like Elliot Cohen, who admitted in the Atlantic magazine, the voice of the US ruling class, he boasted that the US and NATO are waging a proxy war against Russia via Ukraine. So we should take the ruling class in the United States at its actual face value when they say that this is not a war between the small country of Ukraine and the big country of Russia. No, this is a war being waged by the United States and NATO via Ukraine against Russia.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to say, Q, did you have something you wanted to say?
I did want to add something to that, which is that, I mean, anytime that you see somebody working for a mainstream publication going by the title of disinformation reporter, you immediately have to start fact checking everything that they say, or at least whatever it is that they've just fact checked. I mean, run that back and check the footnotes. I remember at the beginning of the conflict, Jane Litvinenko, a former coworker of mine with Canada Land, and also the former misinformation reporter for BuzzFeed, who specialized in Russian disinformation, when the conflict started, sent out a link to various Ukrainian charities, and several of them were fundraisers that for organizations that were providing arms to Azov Battalion and the OUN Battalion, and so there was multiple neo-Nazi and ultra-nationalist organizations that were being provided support through these charity groups that she had linked to. And on top of that was one of the primary misinformation agents for some of the confusion in the early conflict, including the Ghost of Kiev and the Snake Island 13. Never took any of that back. And when people challenged her on it, her response was that she shouldn't have to defend herself and how she defends her country. So you got to keep in mind that a lot of the people that are working in the industry are either, have personal conflicts of interest or ideological conflicts of interest. A lot of people have been listening to people like Andrea Chalupa and Sarah Kendzior, who have been for years, circling the globe and talking about Putin and misinformation and about Russia being the new imperialist state and so on and so on. And all of this has just been absorbed completely uncritically. And it's kind of wild to me that their podcast is called Gaslight Nation, when they've essentially gaslit many Americans and otherwise into buying misinformation propagated by the U.S. defense industry. And the last thing that I wanted to say was, with regard to imperialism, it's important to understand what is meant by imperialism. A lot of times, and I've seen principal socialists get back on their heels about this. People will say, "Oh, so you're an anti-imperialist when it comes to America, but not where it comes to Russia." There's a huge difference between warfare and imperialism. Warfare is warfare, and regardless of whether you think Russia is justified or not, when two countries are at war with one another, it is not simple imperialism because one country invades another. It is imperialism when, let's say, the United States invades Iraq and then proceeds to install its own puppet government and to expropriate Iraqi natural resources and hand it off to U.S. contractors. That is the purpose of imperialism, is for establishing external colonies. When two countries are at war, that is not imperialism. And I really would like to see a lot more pushback on that. And it doesn't mean that you're pro-Russian or pro-Putin and whatever. Frankly, I do not care what people's point of view is on whether they support Russia or not. What I do care about, though, is being rigorous and accurate with what we're talking about when we mention imperialism.
Thank you, Q. So I think that addresses that next questions pretty well. I guess there was also the previous question regarding the way China and India and how it may treat Africa. I don't know if anyone wants to touch on that. I feel like Q's speech might have done pretty well. But Alan, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I can answer that via another question, which I think is very important. It's very important to understand we're not alone. I think it's easy to feel that because of the torrent of propaganda, we're isolated, etc. 5/6 of the world is on our side. So if you're going to get informed, you have to ask the other 5/6 of the world. I mean, just if you take some of the Indian sites that we've been looking at, if you take Rania Hafek's site, which operates out of Lebanon, right? If you take, look at the Russian stuff. There's a ton of Russian bloggers now, and most of them have subtitles over their videos. There's an enormous amount. It's expanding at a huge rate. African sources, absolutely vital. Chinese sources. So read the other guys. There's no shortage of material. We just don't realize it because maybe, the white supremacist stuff gets to us, and we just look at what our own people are saying. And I think we have to get out of that. And the whole reason we put together the manifesto group was, in a certain sense, to get the experience of the people that our own governments are killing and exploiting into the heads of our own self-styled, honest left. But people have to learn from the experience of the world, not just the experience of their own country. The other thing is, and therefore, the point about India and China is to get the answer to that question, you have to look at what is being said in India, China. We can't tell you, right? The culture we're trying to generate is one where people can make their own minds up. And that relates to the fact-checking thing. I urge you to look at our news and analysis site, newcoldwar.org, and you'll see what we're trying to do is we collect stuff from a whole number of sources. Then we say to people, we're trying to equip our readers so they can make their own minds up. And I've had some dialogue with MSM people, and they understand that they're trying to tell people what to think. And people actually don't like being told what to think. So I think the question is not to come out with a line, but to equip a new generation of people who will form the cadre, as Q was saying, of a future movement to think for themselves. Then the next thing is just on this sort of, one of the things I think we don't realize about MSM is they deceive themselves. They actually believe their own shit. And they don't just lie, they're in a bubble. Now, one of the things, when something that they predicted goes very wrong, there's like epiphanies. People suddenly say, oh shit, I believed all this stuff and now I don't know the ground I stand on. So you do get some sudden conversions, and I believe that's going to come when people realize that what they have been saying about Ukraine is not happening. So that's the second thing. Third, on to national and fascism. I think the curious contradiction of fascism is you can't have a fascist international because fascism is inherently nationalists. So the fascists actually fight with each other. What the US project is to reconstruct an international, fascist international around the Azov battalion. That's the project. It's like, one ring to rule, one fascism to rule you all, which was what was unique about Hitler's project. He said, you can have any fascism you like as long as it's German, right? So the USA is saying you can have any fascism you like as long as it's Ukrainian. But the other fascists, like Modi, don't go along with that because they have their own nationalist aspirations. So what do? You don't side with them. You have to put forward an independent left position. And I think the very important thing that is coming up is the US election. I mean, there has to be a third candidate. Otherwise, you get people who will vote for Trump because there's no alternative. So, and as a lot of the Mélenchon people said, voting for Macron or Le Pen is like choosing between cholera and the plague. It's the whole progressive notion that you have to support Biden, Clinton, all these people to keep Trump out. To me, that's not working anymore. To me, that we have to break with that. I'm still thinking this through, but I think that the need for a third party, for all the forces to get together, a third party that puts peace at the front and opposition to fascism at the front, is an urgent need of the hour. So it's always the creation of a third and independent force. that leads back to the question of what kind of international one could have. Well, you have to, if it needs to have the big forces in it. I mean, I've been to many gatherings that have been organized by the Chinese CP or people who are aligned to it, gatherings of Russians, gatherings of Venezuelans, and so on. Well, each one of them acts on its own, but they should be working together. So I think that if the idea of the Conference Against Fascism, which is now being floated in Russia and is being floated in Venezuela, gets out, that some kind of coming together of big forces is what's needed. So I think progressive international is great, but we really have to think big. You have to get, hundreds of millions of people active to be able to throw this back. And they need understanding. They need understanding, and the only way they'll get understanding is by talking to each other. It's sort of a bit rambling, but that's the way I see it.
Thank you, Alan. So I feel like that we've covered all the questions. Does any speaker want to come in and have any final remarks? Any we haven't heard from a while? It's been a while, so I don't blame you for not saying anything. I think with that, then, I think we could probably wrap it up here. Thank you so much to the International Manifesto Group for helping organize this event. Thank you to all the speakers for coming and saying what you had to say. It was really great. I learned so much, and I've got a lot to think about now. But yeah, if you want to stay involved, I'm just a random volunteer who just reached out to the International Manifesto Group, and now I'm here. So this is really exciting. So if you want to volunteer and get involved, I highly recommend you just reach out to the organizations that you're interested in, and the International Manifesto Group is great. But yeah, thanks for coming.
So who's going to wind it up?
Yeah, I guess I don't know how to do that. I'm not the host.
Radical.
I'm winding it up. Bye, everyone, and great moderation, Brandon.